The Mongolian steppes stretched endlessly under vast skis, a landscape so unforgiving that only the most adaptable societies could survive its extremes. Winter temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees Celsius, while summer heat could exceed 35 degrees, creating a climate that demanded constant movement and exceptional resilience. This harsh environment, spanning nearly 3 million square kilometers from the Altai Mountains to the Greater Khingan Range, became the forge that shaped one of history's most formidable warrior cultures. The steppes' seasonal rhythms dictated every aspect of nomadic life. During the brief spring months of April and May, herders moved their livestock, primarily horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and camels, to the fresh pastures that had emerged from the melting snow. These migrations weren't random wanderings, but carefully planned movements following ancient routes passed down through generations. Each tribal group maintained traditional grazing territories, known as nutug, which provided specific advantages during different seasons. Summer camps, called zuzlang, were established in elevated areas where cooler temperatures and abundant grass supported large herds, while winter shelters, or oberlang, were positioned in valleys protected from the fierce northern winds. This perpetual movement created a society where mobility meant survival. Mongol families lived in felt tents called gurs, ingeniously designed structures that could be dismantled and reassembled within an hour. The circular frame, made from collapsible wooden lattices, supported a conical roof covered in multiple layers of felt that provided insulation against both extreme cold and heat. These portable homes, weighing approximately 250 kilograms when fully assembled, could be transported by 2 or 3 camels, allowing entire communities to relocate with remarkable efficiency. The demands of nomadic life produced warriors whose skills were honed from childhood. Boys learned to ride before they could walk properly, spending their days in the saddle while herding animals across vast distances. By age 5, they were competent horsemen. By 10, they could shoot arrows accurately from horseback at full gallop. The Mongol composite bow, crafted from horn, sinew and wood, possessed a draw weight of 80 to 120 pounds, and could accurately strike targets at distances exceeding 300 meters. These weapons required years to master, as riders had to coordinate their horses' movement with the precise timing needed to release arrows at maximum effectiveness. Hunting provided both sustenance and military training. Mongol hunting parties called batu involved coordinated drives where hundreds of riders would form enormous circles, gradually tightening their formation to trap game animals. These exercises, which could last for months and cover thousands of square kilometers, served as large-scale military maneuvers that taught coordination, discipline, and tactical thinking. The skills developed during these hunts, rapid communication across vast distances, coordinated movement of large groups, and the ability to maintain formation while moving at high speeds would later prove invaluable in warfare. The steppe environment also fostered a unique relationship with horses that distinguished Mongols from sedentary peoples. Mongol horses, though smaller than their European counterparts, possessed extraordinary endurance and could survive on sparse vegetation. A typical Mongol warrior maintained a string of 5 to 10 horses, rotating mounts to ensure fresh animals were always available. This practice, known as the remount system, allowed Mongol armies to travel distances that seemed impossible to their enemies. Warriors could cover 80 to 100 kilometers per day, far exceeding the capabilities of infantry-based armies. The social structure that emerged from this environment was complex and fluid, based on kinship ties, personal loyalty, and martial prowess, rather than fixed territorial boundaries. Mongol society was organized around the concept of the ulus, a political unit that could range from a small family group to a confederation of thousands. Leadership within these groups was typically hereditary, but exceptional circumstances could elevate capable individuals regardless of birth. The Khan, or leader, held authority through a combination of traditional legitimacy, personal charisma, and demonstrated success in warfare or diplomacy. Within this framework, several major tribal confederations dominated the Mongolian steppes during the 12th century. The Mongols themselves were divided into numerous subgroups, including the Borjigin, Taichid, Jadaran, and Kiad clans. Each maintained distinct identities and often conflicting interests, despite sharing linguistic and cultural similarities. The Mongol Confederation was neither the largest nor the most powerful of the steppe groups, occupying primarily the regions around the Onon and Kerelen rivers. The Merkid Confederation controlled territories along the Selenga River and its tributaries, commanding strategic positions that allowed them to influence trade routes connecting Mongolia with Siberian regions. Their warriors were renowned for their skill in river warfare and their ability to conduct raids deep into enemy territory. The Merkid maintained a complex relationship with other tribal groups, sometimes serving as allies and other times as bitter enemies depending on shifting political circumstances. To the south and east, the Tatar Confederation held sway over vast territories that bordered the Jin dynasty's frontier regions. The Tatars had developed closer relationships with Chinese authorities than most other steppe peoples, often serving as intermediaries in trade negotiations and military campaigns. This proximity to sedentary civilization had introduced new technologies and administrative practices into Tatar society, making them formidable opponents who combined traditional nomadic warfare with more sophisticated organizational structures. The Karaite Confederation, centered in the region around the Tula River, represented one of the most Christianized groups on the steppes. Nestorian Christianity had spread among the Karaites through trade contacts with Central Asian merchants, creating a unique cultural synthesis that blended Christian beliefs with traditional shamanic practices. Their leader, known as the Ong Khan, maintained diplomatic relations with various Chinese dynasties and had established a court that rivaled those of sedentary rulers in its sophistication. The Nayman Confederation dominated the western portions of the Mongolian steppes, controlling territories that extended toward the Altai Mountains and the borders of the Khwarezmian Empire. They had developed the most advanced administrative system among the steppe peoples, employing Uyghur scribes who maintained written records and conducted diplomatic correspondence. The Nayman possessed knowledge of siege warfare and had acquired Chinese military technologies, including early forms of gunpowder weapons. These tribal confederations existed in a state of constant tension, with alliances forming and dissolving based on immediate tactical advantages rather than long-term strategic considerations. Marriage alliances played crucial roles in diplomatic relationships, as intermarriage between ruling families created networks of obligation and mutual support. However, these same relationships often became sources of conflict when succession disputes arose, or when economic pressures forced groups to compete for the same resources. The Silk Road trade routes that crisscrossed the Mongolian steppes brought more than just commercial opportunities to nomadic societies. Merchants travelling between China and Central Asia required protection and guidance through the dangerous steppe regions, creating opportunities for tribal leaders to extract tribute in exchange for safe passage. This interaction exposed Mongol society to a wide range of cultural influences, technological innovations, and religious ideas that would profoundly shape their worldview. Chinese goods, particularly silk, tea, and metalwork, became highly prized among steppe elites, while Islamic merchants introduced new commercial practices and mathematical concepts. Buddhist and Nestorian Christian missionaries established small communities among various tribal groups, creating religious diversity that would later influence Mongol policies toward conquered peoples. The exchange of ideas wasn't unidirectional. Nomadic peoples contributed their own innovations, particularly in areas of animal husbandry, military tactics, and long-distance communication. The presence of these trade routes also created economic dependencies that affected tribal relationships. Groups that controlled key segments of the routes could accumulate wealth and purchase Chinese manufactured goods, including weapons and armour that provided military advantages. This economic differentiation contributed to the complex hierarchy that existed among steppe peoples, as some groups became wealthy intermediaries while others remained dependent on traditional pastoral activities. The Jin dynasty, which had conquered northern China in 1115, viewed the Mongolian steppes as both a threat and an opportunity. Chinese administrators understood that unified steppe peoples posed existential dangers to sedentary civilizations, as demonstrated by previous nomadic invasions. The Jin response was a calculated policy of divide and conquer, deliberately fostering conflicts between tribal groups to prevent the emergence of unified leadership. Jin officials provided military support to weaker tribal confederations when they faced threats from stronger neighbours, ensuring that no single group could dominate the steppes. They distributed titles and gifts to various khans, creating competing claims to legitimacy that fueled ongoing disputes. Chinese weapons and armor were selectively distributed to maintain balance between rival factions, while diplomatic missions worked to exacerbate existing tensions. This policy proved devastatingly effective in the short term, as tribal warfare intensified throughout the latter half of the 12th century. The Tatars, serving as Jin proxies, conducted numerous campaigns against other tribal groups, particularly targeting the Mongols, whom Chinese authorities viewed as potentially dangerous. These conflicts created cycles of revenge and retaliation that consumed enormous resources and prevented the development of stable political institutions. The Jin strategy also involved economic manipulation, as Chinese authorities could restrict or encourage trade depending on tribal behavior. Groups that opposed Jin interests found their access to Chinese markets limited, while compliant tribes received preferential treatment. This economic pressure forced tribal leaders to make difficult choices between independence and prosperity, often leading to internal divisions as different factions advocated for different approaches to Chinese relations. The cumulative effect of these policies was the creation of a political environment characterized by chronic instability and mutual suspicion. Tribal leaders who might have cooperated under different circumstances found themselves locked in conflicts that served Chinese interests rather than their own. The traditional steppe practice of forming temporary alliances based on mutual benefit became increasingly difficult as groups were forced to choose sides in larger conflicts orchestrated by external powers. Into this fractured landscape of competing tribal confederations and Chinese manipulation was born a child who would fundamentally alter the trajectory of world history. Temujin entered the world around 1162, clutching a blood clot in his tiny fist according to Mongol tradition, an omen that shamans interpreted as a sign he would become a great warrior. His father Yesugai led a minor branch of the Borjigin clan within the broader Mongol Confederation, controlling perhaps 40,000 people scattered across the valleys of the Onon River. The Borjigin occupied a precarious position in the complex hierarchy of steppe politics, possessing enough strength to maintain independence but lacking the resources to challenge the dominant Karaite or Tatar confederations. Yesugai had built his modest power base through a combination of military prowess and strategic marriages. His primary wife, Holan, had originally been married to a Merkid chief named Chiladu, but Yesugai had abducted her during a raid, a common practice that served both romantic and political purposes in steppe society. This act of bride kidnapping created a blood feud with the Merkids that would plague Temujin's family for decades, demonstrating how personal actions could have far-reaching political consequences in the interconnected world of nomadic tribes. The young Temujin's childhood unfolded against the backdrop of constant low-level warfare that characterized steppe life. His earliest memories involved the sight of armed riders approaching their camp, the hurried packing of essential belongings, and the tense negotiations that determined whether visitors came as friends or enemies. By age 5, he was already spending full days in the saddle, learning to guide his horse with his knees while his hands remained free to handle weapons or tools. The harsh realities of nomadic existence meant that children matured quickly, assuming adult responsibilities while still developing the physical and mental capabilities needed for survival. Yesugai recognized that his son's future depended on forming strategic alliances that could strengthen the Borjigin clan's position. When Temujin reached 9 years old, his father arranged a betrothal with Borta, the daughter of Dei Seshen, who led a subgroup of the Ongirat tribe. This marriage alliance would connect the Borjigin with a confederation known for producing beautiful women who often became wives of powerful Khans, thereby gaining influence through their offspring. The betrothal ceremony involved complex negotiations over bride price, the exchange of gifts, and the establishment of mutual obligations that would bind the two families together. Following steppe custom, Temujin remained with his future in-laws to serve Dei Seshen and demonstrate his worthiness as a husband. This arrangement served multiple purposes. It allowed the boy to learn different tribal customs, established personal relationships that would prove valuable in future political negotiations, and provided Dei Seshen with an additional worker whose labour contributed to the household's prosperity. Temujin spent several months with the Ongirat, participating in their daily routines and observing how different tribal groups organised their societies. The trajectory of Temujin's life changed dramatically when Yesugai decided to retrieve his son for a family gathering. During their journey home, they encountered a group of Tatars who were celebrating at a feast. Despite the long-standing enmity between Mongols and Tatars, steppe hospitality customs required that travellers be welcomed and fed. Yasugei, perhaps influenced by the festive atmosphere, or believing that temporary truces during celebrations would be honoured, accepted the Tatars' invitation to join their meal. The Tatars, however, had not forgotten previous raids conducted by Yasugei against their people. They had mixed poison into the food served to the Mongol chief, using a slow-acting toxin that would not take effect until he had travelled far from their camp. This method of assassination was particularly insidious because it avoided direct confrontation while ensuring that the victim would die away from potential witnesses or allies who might seek immediate revenge. Yasugei began experiencing severe abdominal pain and nausea during the return journey, but initially attributed these symptoms to spoiled food or the rigours of travel. As his condition worsened, he realised he had been poisoned and understood that his death was imminent. With his remaining strength, he managed to reach the family camp and summoned his eldest son to his bedside. The dying chief's final instructions to Temujin emphasised the importance of maintaining tribal unity and warned about the dangers that would face the family once news of his death spread among their enemies. The death of Yasugei created an immediate power vacuum within the Borjigin clan that his widow Holan was unable to fill. Mongol society, despite according women significant respect and influence, did not permit female leadership of military units during times of conflict. The clan's sub-chiefs, recognizing that a leaderless group would become vulnerable to attacks from neighboring tribes, began making independent arrangements for their own survival. Most devastating was the decision by Tagutai, chief of the Taichut tribe, who had previously acknowledged Yasugei's authority, to abandon the family entirely. Tagutai's abandonment was not merely a personal betrayal, but a calculated political decision based on the harsh realities of steppe life. Supporting a widow with young children would require significant resources while providing no immediate military benefits. The Taichut chief likely reasoned that associating with Yasugei's family would make his own people targets for Tatar revenge attacks, while distancing himself from them would improve his tribe's security. This pragmatic approach to alliance building reflected the fundamental instability that characterized steppe political relationships. The abandoned family faced immediate threats to their survival as winter approached. Holan, left with 4 young sons and 2 daughters, possessed no livestock beyond a few horses and lacked the manpower needed to conduct successful hunting expeditions. The family was forced to subsist on fish caught in the Onon River, wild roots and berries, and small game that the boys could trap or kill with primitive weapons. This period of extreme hardship lasted for several years, during which Temujin learned lessons about survival, resourcefulness, and the importance of absolute loyalty within small groups. The experience of near starvation profoundly shaped Temujin's worldview and future leadership style. He observed how quickly former allies abandoned his family when supporting them became inconvenient, teaching him that loyalty based solely on mutual benefit was inherently unstable. The young boy also learned to make difficult decisions about resource allocation, sometimes choosing to let weaker family members go hungry so that stronger ones could maintain their capacity for hunting and protection. These harsh lessons in pragmatic leadership would later influence his approach to military command and imperial administration. During this period of exile, Temujin's relationship with his half-brother Begta became increasingly strained. Begta, who was slightly older and physically stronger, often claimed the largest portions of food and asserted authority over hunting expeditions. The tension between the brothers reflected deeper questions about leadership succession and resource distribution that would have been resolved by their father's presence. When Begta began taking fish and game that Temujin had caught, the future conqueror decided that his half-brother's behaviour threatened the family's survival. Temujin's decision to kill Begta represented a turning point in his psychological development. He carefully planned the assassination, enlisting his younger brother Kasa as an accomplice, and choosing a moment when Begta was isolated and vulnerable. The murder was carried out with arrows shot from close range, ensuring that the victim would die quickly and quietly. This act of fratricide demonstrated Temujin's willingness to eliminate threats to his authority, even when those threats came from within his own family. The killing of Begta horrified Holan, who recognized that her son had crossed a moral boundary that would have profound consequences for his character development. Her reaction also reflected the practical concern that internal violence would weaken the family's already precarious position. However, Temujin's action had effectively established his leadership within the family group, eliminating a potential rival and demonstrating his determination to make whatever sacrifices were necessary for survival. News of Begta's death eventually reached the Taichiud, who used it as justification for capturing Temujin. Targutai claimed that the young man had become dangerous and needed to be controlled before he could threaten other tribal members. The real motivation was likely Targutai's recognition that Temujin was developing into a potential leader who might eventually challenge Taichiud authority. By capturing and humiliating Yasuge's son, the Taichiud chief hoped to eliminate a future threat, while demonstrating his own power to other tribal groups. Temujin's capture involved a nighttime raid on the family camp, during which he was seized and transported to the Taichiud settlement. His captors fitted him with a wooden collar called a kang, a heavy restraint that prevented him from moving his head freely and made escape extremely difficult. The kang served both as a physical restraint and as a symbol of humiliation, marking its wearer as a prisoner whose status had been reduced to that of a slave. Temujin was forced to move from household to household within the Taichiud camp, performing menial labour while his captors decided his ultimate fate. The young prisoner's escape from Taichiud custody demonstrated both his resourcefulness and his ability to inspire loyalty in unexpected quarters. During a festival celebration, when many of his guards were drunk, Temujin managed to slip away from the camp despite the cumbersome kang. He sought refuge with a family whose head, Sorkan Shira, had shown him kindness during his captivity. Rather than turning him over to the search parties that were combing the area, Sorkan Shira and his sons helped remove the wooden collar and provided directions to safety. This act of compassion from a member of the tribe that had imprisoned him taught Temujin another crucial lesson about human nature and leadership. He learned that individual character could transcend tribal loyalties, and that treating people with respect and dignity could create unexpected alliances. The assistance he received from Sorkan Shira's family would later influence his policies toward defeated enemies and his willingness to incorporate capable individuals into his administration, regardless of their tribal origins. Temujin's successful escape and return to his family mark the beginning of his transformation from a desperate fugitive into a leader capable of attracting followers. Word of his daring escape spread throughout the region, enhancing his reputation for courage and resourcefulness. Young men from various tribal groups began seeking him out, drawn by stories of his exploits and hoping to benefit from association with someone who seemed destined for greatness. These early followers formed the nucleus of what would eventually become the most formidable military force in medieval history. The process of building a following required Temujin to master the complex art of steppe diplomacy. He needed to convince potential allies that supporting him would benefit their own interests, while simultaneously demonstrating enough strength to deter attacks from enemies. This delicate balance required careful attention to tribal customs, respect for traditional hierarchies, and the ability to project confidence even when his actual resources remained limited. Temujin's success in attracting followers during this period demonstrated his natural charisma and his understanding of the psychological factors that motivated steppe warriors. One of the most significant relationships formed during this period was with Jamukha, a young chief from the Jadaran clan, who had become both Temujin's closest friend and his most dangerous rival. The two men had known each other since childhood and shared similar backgrounds as ambitious leaders seeking to expand their influence within the fractured Mongol Confederation. Their friendship was formalized through the ancient ritual of Anda, or blood brotherhood, which created bonds of mutual obligation that were considered more sacred than kinship ties. The Anda ceremony involved the exchange of gifts, the sharing of blood, and elaborate oaths of eternal loyalty sworn before witnesses from both men's followers. Jamukha and Temujin exchanged golden belts and horses, symbols of their equal status and mutual respect. The ritual created a relationship that transcended tribal boundaries and established a foundation for military cooperation that would prove crucial in the campaigns that followed. For several years, the two blood brothers operated as partners, combining their forces for raids against common enemies and sharing the spoils of their victories. The alliance with Jamukha provided Temujin with access to a larger pool of warriors and the military experience needed to conduct successful campaigns. Jamukha had inherited leadership of the Jadaran at a young age and possessed extensive knowledge of steppe warfare tactics. Under his guidance, Temujin learned advanced techniques for coordinating cavalry charges, conducting reconnaissance missions, and managing supply lines during extended campaigns. This military education proved invaluable as Temujin began planning more ambitious operations against the tribal confederations that had previously seemed beyond his reach. The partnership between the two blood brothers was tested when the Merkids launched a massive raid designed to settle their long-standing grievance against Yesugei's family. The Merkid chiefs had never forgotten Holan's abduction years earlier, and they viewed Temujin's growing influence as an opportunity to extract revenge while eliminating a potential future threat. The raid was carefully planned to coincide with a period when Temujin's forces were dispersed across a wide area, making coordinated resistance difficult. The Merkid attack succeeded in capturing Borta, Temujin's wife, along with several other women from his camp. This act of retaliation followed the same pattern as Yesugei's original abduction of Holan, demonstrating how cycles of revenge could persist across generations in steppe society. The loss of his wife represented both a personal tragedy and a political disaster for Temujin, as his inability to protect his own family undermined his credibility as a leader capable of defending his followers. Temujin's response to this crisis revealed the strategic thinking that would characterize his later military campaigns. Rather than launching an immediate counterattack with his limited forces, he sought allies who could provide the manpower needed for a successful rescue operation. He approached both Jamukha and Togrul, the Karaite leader known as Ong Khan, requesting their assistance in recovering his wife and restoring his honour. This decision to seek help rather than acting independently demonstrated his understanding that successful leadership sometimes required swallowing pride in favour of practical considerations. The campaign to rescue Borta brought together a coalition force that included warriors from multiple tribal groups, united by personal loyalties and shared interests. Togrul's participation was motivated by his friendship with Yesugei and his desire to maintain influence within the Mongol Confederation. Jamukha's involvement reflected his obligations as Temujin's blood brother and his recognition that Merkid's success might encourage other tribes to launch similar attacks. The combined force numbered several thousand warriors, representing one of the largest military coalitions assembled on the Mongolian steppes in recent memory. The assault on the Merkid camps demonstrated innovative tactical approaches that would become hallmarks of Mongol warfare. Rather than conducting a direct frontal attack, the coalition forces used their superior mobility to surround the enemy settlements and prevent escape. Coordinated strikes from multiple directions created confusion among the Merkid defenders, while minimizing casualties among the attacking forces. The campaign succeeded in recovering Borta and inflicting significant losses on the Merkids, but it also revealed tensions between Temujin and Jamukha that would eventually destroy their partnership. The success of the Merkid campaign marked a crucial turning point in Temujin's evolution, from tribal leader to imperial architect. The coordination required to manage warriors from multiple confederations during the rescue of Borta had revealed both the potential and the limitations of traditional steppe military organization. While the campaign achieved its immediate objectives, the difficulties in maintaining unified command over diverse tribal units convinced Temujin that fundamental reforms would be necessary to create a truly effective fighting force capable of sustained conquest. The traditional steppe military system relied heavily on kinship ties and personal loyalty to individual chiefs, creating a fragmented command structure that proved inadequate for large-scale operations. Warriors fought primarily alongside their clan brothers and followed orders from leaders they had known since childhood, but this familiarity bred a casual attitude toward discipline that could prove catastrophic in complex military situations. During the Merkid campaign, Temujin had observed how tribal contingents would sometimes pursue their own tactical objectives rather than following the overall battle plan, creating gaps in the formation that enemy forces could exploit. The aftermath of the Merkid victory also highlighted the challenges of maintaining unity among diverse tribal groups once the immediate threat had passed. Different confederations had participated in the campaign for varying reasons, and their expectations regarding the distribution of spoils reflected these different motivations. Some groups expected to receive captured livestock and prisoners in proportion to their contributions to the fighting, while others viewed their participation as fulfilling existing obligations that required no additional compensation. These competing expectations created tensions that threatened to undermine future cooperation. Temujin's response to these organizational challenges began with his decision to formalize the legal and administrative framework that would govern his expanding confederation. The Great Yasa, as this comprehensive legal code became known, represented a revolutionary departure from traditional steppe governance systems. Rather than relying on customary law that varied between tribal groups and could be interpreted differently by various chiefs, the Yasa established uniform standards that applied to all members of Temujin's confederation regardless of their tribal origins. The development of the Yasa required extensive consultation with tribal elders, shamans, and military commanders who possessed deep knowledge of steppe customs and practical experience in governance. Temujin assembled these advisors during extended council sessions, where different aspects of the legal code were debated and refined. The process took several years to complete, as each provision needed to be carefully crafted to address specific problems while remaining consistent with the overall framework. The resulting document contained detailed regulations covering military organization, criminal justice, religious practices, and administrative procedures. One of the most revolutionary aspects of the Yasa was its establishment of meritocracy as the primary basis for advancement within the Confederation. Traditional steppe society had been dominated by hereditary nobility, whose authority derived from their bloodlines and ancestral achievements rather than their personal capabilities. The Yasa explicitly rejected this system, declaring that positions of responsibility would be awarded based on demonstrated competence and loyalty, rather than family connections. This principle applied not only to military commands, but also to administrative positions, diplomatic assignments, and judicial roles. The meritocratic provisions of the Yasa created opportunities for individuals from humble backgrounds to achieve positions of significant authority within the Confederation. Talented warriors who distinguished themselves in battle could be promoted to command positions, regardless of their tribal affiliations, while skilled administrators could advance to high-ranking posts based on their ability to manage complex logistical operations. This system incentivized excellence and innovation, while ensuring that the most capable individuals were placed in positions where their talents could benefit the entire Confederation. The implementation of meritocracy required the creation of standardized evaluation procedures that could assess individual capabilities objectively. The Yasa established specific criteria for different types of positions, including combat skills for military commands, literacy and numerical competence for administrative roles, and negotiation abilities for diplomatic assignments. Regular assessments were conducted to ensure that appointed officials continued to meet these standards, with provisions for demotion or reassignment when performance declined. Religious tolerance represented another groundbreaking aspect of the Yasa that distinguished Temujin's confederation from other steppe political entities. Traditional tribal societies had typically been dominated by shamanic practices that emphasized the spiritual authority of particular clans or regions, creating religious hierarchies that reinforced existing political structures. The Yasa rejected this approach, declaring that all religious traditions would be respected and protected within the Confederation, as long as their practitioners remained loyal to the central authority. This policy of religious tolerance served multiple practical purposes beyond its moral implications. The Mongolian steppes contained diverse religious communities, including Buddhists, Nestorian Christians, Muslims, and various shamanistic traditions, each of which possessed valuable skills and knowledge that could benefit the Confederation. By guaranteeing religious freedom, the Yasa encouraged these communities to participate fully in the Confederation's activities, rather than viewing themselves as marginalized minorities who might benefit from supporting rival political movements. The religious provisions of the Yasa also facilitated the integration of conquered territories whose populations practiced different faiths. Rather than attempting to impose shamanic beliefs on defeated peoples, the Confederation could promise religious continuity in exchange for political submission. This approach reduced resistance to Mongol rule and encouraged local religious leaders to cooperate with the new administration, providing valuable intelligence about local conditions and helping to maintain stability during the transition period. The military organization established by the Yasa represented perhaps the most significant innovation in the Confederation's institutional framework. The traditional steppe military system had been based on tribal units that fought alongside their kinsmen under the command of hereditary chiefs. While this arrangement fostered strong internal cohesion, it also created limitations in terms of tactical flexibility and strategic coordination. The Yasa replaced this system with a decimal organization that divided all military forces into standardized units based on numerical rather than kinship principles. The decimal system established 4 primary unit sizes that form the backbone of the Confederation's military structure. The smallest unit, known as an arban, consisted of exactly 10 warriors who were responsible for maintaining their equipment, sharing resources, and supporting each other during combat operations. These men were typically drawn from different tribal backgrounds, deliberately mixing warriors who might not have previous relationships to prevent the formation of subgroups that could undermine unit cohesion. Each arban was commanded by a leader selected based on his military experience and leadership capabilities, rather than his tribal connections. 10 arbans were combined to form a jagun, a unit of 100 warriors that served as the basic tactical formation for most military operations. The jagun commander, known as a jagun-u-noyan, possessed authority over all aspects of his unit's training, equipment, and deployment. These commanders were carefully selected based on their demonstrated ability to coordinate complex operations and maintain discipline under combat conditions. The jagun structure allowed for rapid communication and coordinated movement, while providing sufficient flexibility to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. The mingan, consisting of 1,000 warriors organized into 10 jaguns, represented the standard formation for major military campaigns. At this level, the organizational structure became more complex, requiring specialized staff officers to manage logistics, intelligence, and communications. The mingan commander, or mingan-u-noyan, typically possessed extensive military experience and had demonstrated his ability to coordinate large-scale operations. These units were capable of independent operations over extended periods, carrying their own supplies and maintaining their own reconnaissance capabilities. The largest standard military unit was the tumen, consisting of 10,000 warriors organized into 10 mingans. The tumen represented a complete military force capable of conducting major campaigns against enemy states or confederations. Command of a tumen required exceptional organizational skills and strategic thinking, as these units needed to coordinate the activities of numerous subordinate formations while maintaining overall tactical coherence. Tumen commanders were typically drawn from Temujin's most trusted associates and possessed both military expertise and political acumen. The decimal organization transcended traditional tribal loyalties by deliberately mixing warriors from different backgrounds within each unit. This integration process, known as the breaking of the tribes, represented a conscious effort to create new identities based on military service rather than kinship ties. Warriors who had previously identified primarily with their clan or tribal group gradually developed stronger loyalties to their decimal unit and its commanders. This transformation was facilitated by shared training exercises, common living arrangements, and the distribution of rewards based on unit performance rather than individual tribal contributions. The implementation of the decimal system required extensive training programs to ensure that all warriors understood their roles within the new organizational structure. Traditional steppe warfare had relied heavily on individual initiative and informal coordination, but the decimal system demanded precise timing and coordinated movement that could only be achieved through disciplined training. Warriors practiced formation movements, communication procedures, and tactical maneuvers until they could execute complex operations with minimal verbal commands. The training regimen established by the Yasa emphasized the development of skills that would prove essential for large-scale military operations. Warriors learned to maintain formation during extended marches, coordinate their movements with adjacent units, and respond quickly to changing tactical situations. The training also included specialized instruction in siege warfare, river crossings, and urban combat, skills that would prove crucial as the Confederation expanded beyond the traditional steppe environment. The sophisticated intelligence network established under the Yasa represented another crucial innovation that distinguished Temujin's confederation from other steppe political entities. Traditional tribal warfare had relied primarily on scouts and hunters who could provide information about immediate threats or opportunities, but the Confederation's expanding ambitions required more comprehensive intelligence gathering capabilities. The Yasa established a formal intelligence service that collected information about distant territories, enemy military capabilities, and political developments that could affect the Confederation's strategic interests. The intelligence network operated through multiple channels that provided redundant sources of information about target areas. Merchants traveling along established trade routes served as valuable intelligence assets, gathering information about economic conditions, military preparations, and political tensions in the regions they visited. These commercial agents were particularly effective because their presence in foreign territories aroused no suspicion, allowing them to observe enemy activities and establish contacts with local informants. Diplomatic missions provided another important source of intelligence about potential enemies and allies. The Confederation's diplomatic corps, established under the provisions of the Yasa, included skilled negotiators who could gather detailed information about foreign courts while conducting official business. These diplomats were trained to observe military installations, assess the loyalty of local populations, and identify potential allies who might be recruited to support future military operations. The intelligence network also included specialized reconnaissance units that conducted covert operations in enemy territory. These units, composed of warriors selected for their stealth and survival skills, could penetrate deep into hostile regions to gather information about military dispositions, fortification systems, and supply routes. The reconnaissance teams operated for extended periods without support, relying on their training and resourcefulness to avoid detection, while collecting detailed intelligence about enemy capabilities. The information gathered by the intelligence network was processed through a centralized analysis system that could identify patterns and trends that might not be apparent to individual agents. Skilled administrators, many of whom had been recruited from conquered territories, compiled reports from multiple sources to create comprehensive assessments of enemy strengths and weaknesses. These intelligence summaries provided the foundation for strategic planning and tactical decision-making that gave the Confederation significant advantages over enemies who lacked similar information-gathering capabilities. The integration of conquered specialists represented a crucial element of the Confederation's expanding capabilities. The Yasa established procedures for identifying and recruiting skilled individuals from defeated territories who could contribute to the Confederation's military and administrative effectiveness. Rather than treating all conquered peoples as potential enemies, the legal code created mechanisms for incorporating valuable specialists into the Confederation's service, while ensuring their loyalty through a combination of incentives and oversight. Chinese siege engineers represented one of the most valuable categories of specialists recruited through this process. The Confederation's expansion beyond the steppes required the ability to capture fortified cities and overcome defensive systems that traditional nomadic warfare could not address effectively. Chinese engineers possessed sophisticated knowledge of siege warfare, including the construction of catapults, the use of gunpowder weapons, and the techniques needed to breach stone fortifications. These specialists were offered generous compensation and high-ranking positions within the military hierarchy in exchange for their technical expertise. Muslim administrators from Central Asian territories provided another crucial category of recruited specialists. These individuals possessed literacy skills, mathematical knowledge, and administrative experience that proved invaluable for managing the Confederation's expanding territories. Many had previous experience in tax collection, judicial administration, and diplomatic correspondence that could be adapted to serve the Confederation's needs. The integration of these administrators required careful attention to their religious and cultural backgrounds to ensure their effective cooperation with the existing command structure. Craftsmen from various conquered territories contributed specialized skills that enhanced the Confederation's military capabilities. Metalworkers from Chinese territories improved the quality of weapons and armor available to Confederation forces, while leatherworkers from Central Asian regions developed better protective equipment for cavalry operations. These craftsmen were typically organized into specialized workshops that could produce equipment according to standardized specifications, ensuring consistent quality across all military units. The integration process established by the Yasa included provisions for monitoring the loyalty and performance of recruited specialists. New recruits were typically assigned to work alongside trusted Confederation members who could observe their activities and report any suspicious behavior. Gradual increases in responsibility and authority were granted based on demonstrated competence and loyalty, with full integration into the Confederation's leadership structure requiring years of faithful service. The administrative framework created by the Yasa established standardized procedures for managing the Confederation's expanding territories and diverse populations. Traditional steppe governance had been highly personal and informal, relying on direct relationships between leaders and their followers. The Confederation's growth made this approach impractical, requiring the development of institutional mechanisms that could function effectively across vast distances and cultural differences. The administrative system established clear hierarchies of authority that connected local commanders with the central leadership through formal reporting relationships. Regional governors were appointed to oversee specific territories, with their authority clearly defined in terms of military command, tax collection, and judicial administration. These appointments were made based on demonstrated competence and loyalty, rather than traditional tribal affiliations, ensuring that the most capable individuals were placed in positions of responsibility. The administrative reforms codified in the Great Yasa provided the organizational foundation that would enable Temujin's confederation to undertake the systematic conquest of the world's most populous and technologically advanced civilization. China in the early 13th century presented challenges fundamentally different from those encountered in steppe warfare, requiring the Mongols to develop new military techniques, administrative systems, and cultural approaches that could effectively govern sedentary agricultural populations numbering in the tens of millions. The Western Xia Kingdom, occupying the strategic corridor between the Mongolian steppes and the Chinese heartland, became the first target of Mongol expansion beyond the traditional nomadic territories. This Tangut state controlled approximately 830,000 square kilometers of territory, stretching from the Gobi Desert to the upper reaches of the Yellow River, encompassing vital trade routes that connected China with Central Asia. The Western Xia possessed a sophisticated military organization that combined traditional Chinese defensive strategies with nomadic cavalry tactics, creating a hybrid system that had successfully resisted previous steppe invasions. The Tangut military structure centered around fortified cities that served as administrative centers and defensive strongholds capable of withstanding extended sieges. These urban fortifications, constructed using rammed earth techniques reinforced with wooden frameworks, could accommodate large garrison forces and civilian populations during times of conflict. The cities were connected by an extensive network of beacon towers and fortified outposts that provided early warning of approaching enemies and facilitated rapid communication across the kingdom's vast territories. Temujin's decision to target the Western Xia reflected his understanding that successful expansion into China would require extensive preparation and experience in siege warfare. The Tangut Kingdom offered an ideal testing ground for developing the military techniques and administrative practices that would prove essential for conquering larger Chinese states. The relatively small size of the Western Xia military forces meant that initial campaigns could be conducted with manageable risks, while the kingdom's sophisticated defensive systems provided opportunities to experiment with siege techniques without facing the massive armies that defended the Jin dynasty's territories. The first Mongol campaign against the Western Xia began in 1209 with a series of probing attacks designed to assess Tangut military capabilities and identify weaknesses in their defensive systems. Rather than attempting to capture major cities immediately, Mongol forces concentrated on disrupting the kingdom's economic infrastructure by targeting irrigation systems, trade routes, and agricultural settlements. These attacks demonstrated the Mongols' understanding that prolonged sieges of fortified cities would be costly and time-consuming, while economic warfare could achieve strategic objectives more efficiently. The Mongol approach to siege warfare evolved rapidly during the Western Xia campaigns, as commanders learned to adapt traditional steppe tactics to the requirements of urban combat. The Confederation's engineers, many of whom had been recruited from conquered Chinese territories, developed innovative techniques for breaching fortified walls and overcoming defensive obstacles. These specialists constructed siege engines based on Chinese designs but modified to take advantage of Mongol organizational strengths and tactical preferences. The siege of Yinchuan, the Western Xia capital, demonstrated the sophisticated coordination required for successful urban warfare. Mongol forces surrounded the city with multiple siege lines that prevented the escape of defenders while maintaining supply routes for the attacking army. The besiegers constructed elaborate earthworks and wooden fortifications that protected their own forces while providing platforms for siege engines and artillery pieces. The coordination of these construction projects required precise timing and resource management that showcased the effectiveness of the decimal military organization established by the Great Yasa. The psychological aspects of siege warfare proved as important as the technical challenges of breaching fortifications. Mongol commanders understood that prolonged sieges could demoralize both attacking and defending forces, potentially leading to mutinies or desertions that could undermine military effectiveness. The Confederation developed sophisticated propaganda techniques designed to encourage surrender by emphasizing the futility of resistance, while offering generous terms to cities that submitted voluntarily. These psychological operations included the deliberate massacre of populations in cities that resisted, creating a reputation for ruthlessness that encouraged other settlements to surrender without fighting. The administration of conquered Western Xie territories required the development of new governmental systems that could effectively manage sedentary agricultural populations. Traditional Mongol governance had been designed for nomadic societies where populations were constantly mobile and resource allocation was based on seasonal patterns. The Confederation needed to create institutional mechanisms that could collect taxes from farmers, maintain irrigation systems, and regulate trade activities that formed the foundation of Tangut economic life. The Mongol solution involved the recruitment of local administrators who possessed the technical knowledge and cultural understanding necessary for effective governance. Tangut officials who demonstrated loyalty to the new regime were retained in their positions, while those who resisted were replaced with carefully selected candidates who'd proven their competence and reliability. This approach preserved the existing administrative infrastructure while ensuring that key positions were held by individuals committed to Mongol rule. The integration of Tangut military specialists into the Confederation's forces provided valuable experience in combined arms operations that would prove crucial in subsequent campaigns. Tangut cavalry units, which had been trained in both Chinese and nomadic warfare techniques, were incorporated into Mongol armies where they served as intermediaries between traditional steppe warriors and Chinese military specialists. These units possessed knowledge of Chinese military organization, siege warfare techniques, and urban combat methods that complemented the Mongols' superior mobility and tactical flexibility. The successful conquest of the Western Xia also provided the Confederation with access to Chinese military technology and manufacturing capabilities that significantly enhanced their combat effectiveness. Tangut armories contained sophisticated weapons, including crossbows, catapults, and early firearms that were more advanced than anything available on the steppes. The Confederation's craftsmen studied these weapons and developed improved versions that could be mass-produced using the decimal organization system established by the Great Yasa. The protracted war against the Jin dynasty, which began in 1211, represented a far greater challenge than the Western Xia campaigns, due to the enormous size of the Jin military forces and the sophisticated defensive systems protecting northern China. The Jin dynasty controlled approximately 2.3 million square kilometers of territory, with a population exceeding 50 million people, making it one of the largest and most powerful states in the medieval world. The dynasty's military organization included professional armies totaling over 600,000 soldiers, supported by extensive fortification networks and advanced siege warfare capabilities. The Jin military system combined traditional Chinese organizational principles with innovations developed during their conquest of the Song dynasty's northern territories. The dynasty's forces included heavily armored cavalry units modeled on steppe warfare techniques, professional infantry formations trained in siege warfare and urban combat, and specialized engineering corps capable of constructing and maintaining complex fortification systems. These forces were supported by an extensive logistics network that could supply large armies during extended campaigns across vast distances. The initial Mongol strategy against the Jin dynasty focused on disrupting the enemy's economic and military infrastructure, rather than attempting to capture major cities immediately. Mongol forces conducted systematic raids against agricultural settlements, trade routes, and military installations throughout the Jin dynasty's northern territories. These attacks were designed to reduce the dynasty's ability to support large armies while gathering intelligence about enemy defensive capabilities and identifying potential allies among the local population. The siege of Zhongdu, the Jin dynasty's capital city, known today as Beijing, became the defining engagement of the early war period. The city's fortifications represented the pinnacle of Chinese defensive architecture, featuring massive walls constructed from rammed earth and stone that rose over 12 meters in height and extended for more than 20 kilometers around the urban core. The walls were reinforced with numerous towers and bastions that provided overlapping fields of fire for defending archers and artillery pieces. The Mongol approach to the Zhongdu siege demonstrated their growing sophistication in urban warfare and their ability to adapt Chinese military technology to their own tactical preferences. Rather than attempting a direct assault on the city's formidable walls, Mongol commanders established a comprehensive blockade that prevented the entry of supplies and reinforcements. This strategy required the coordination of multiple armies totaling over 100,000 warriors, representing one of the largest military operations ever conducted by nomadic forces. The siege operations included the construction of elaborate earthworks and wooden fortifications that surrounded the city with multiple defensive lines. These works protected the besieging forces from sorties by the city's defenders while providing platforms for siege engines and artillery pieces. The Mongol engineers, working under the direction of Chinese specialists who had defected to the Confederation, constructed catapults, trebuchets, and other siege weapons that could breach the city's walls or destroy buildings within the urban core. The psychological impact of the Zhongdu siege extended far beyond the immediate military objectives, as the successful blockade of the Jin dynasty's capital demonstrated the Mongols' ability to threaten the very heart of Chinese civilization. The siege created panic throughout the dynasty's territories as local officials and military commanders recognized that their government was unable to protect even its most important cities. This psychological warfare proved as effective as the physical destruction inflicted by Mongol forces, encouraging defections and reducing resistance in other regions. The adaptation of Chinese military technology during the Jin campaigns significantly enhanced the Confederation's combat capabilities and provided the foundation for future conquests. Mongol forces learned to operate Chinese siege engines, artillery pieces, and naval vessels that had been previously unknown on the steppes. These technological acquisitions were systematically studied and improved by Confederation specialists who developed new versions that could be more easily transported and operated by nomadic forces. The integration of Chinese administrative practices into the Confederation's governmental system represented another crucial development that emerged from the Jin campaigns. The Mongols discovered that governing large sedentary populations required sophisticated bureaucratic institutions that could manage tax collection, judicial administration, and economic regulation on a scale far exceeding anything previously attempted by nomadic societies. Chinese administrative techniques, including written record keeping, standardized taxation systems, and professional civil service examinations, were adapted to serve the Confederation's expanding governmental needs. The recruitment of Chinese military and administrative specialists accelerated during the Jin campaigns, as the Confederation recognized the value of incorporating skilled individuals from conquered territories. Chinese engineers provided expertise in siege warfare, fortification construction, and artillery operations that proved essential for urban combat. Administrative specialists contributed knowledge of taxation systems, legal procedures, and diplomatic protocols that enabled the effective governance of conquered territories. The final conquest of the Song dynasty under Kublai Khan's leadership represented the culmination of Mongol expansion into China and the establishment of the Yuan dynasty as the first foreign regime to rule the entire Chinese empire. The Song dynasty, which had controlled southern China since the 10th century, possessed the world's most advanced economy and military technology, including sophisticated naval forces, gunpowder weapons, and industrial manufacturing capabilities that exceeded those of any contemporary civilization. The Song military system had evolved to emphasize defensive warfare and technological superiority, rather than the large-scale cavalry operations that characterized northern Chinese dynasties. Song forces included professional armies equipped with advanced crossbows, early firearms, and explosive weapons that could inflict devastating casualties on attacking forces. The dynasty's naval capabilities were particularly formidable, featuring large warships equipped with catapults, flamethrowers, and cannon that could dominate riverine and coastal warfare. The Mongol conquest of the Song dynasty required fundamental changes in military organization and tactical approaches that reflected the unique challenges of southern Chinese terrain and defensive systems. The region's numerous rivers, mountains, and fortified cities created obstacles that traditional steppe warfare techniques could not overcome effectively. Mongol forces needed to develop new capabilities in naval warfare, mountain combat, and siege operations that could succeed against the Song dynasty's sophisticated defensive systems. The establishment of the Yuan dynasty in 1271 marked the beginning of a new phase in Chinese history, characterized by the synthesis of Mongol administrative practices with traditional Chinese governmental institutions. Kublai Khan's regime attempted to balance the needs of Mongol rulers with the expectations of Chinese subjects, creating hybrid institutions that combined elements from both cultures. This synthesis required careful attention to cultural sensitivities and practical considerations that could ensure effective governance while maintaining the loyalty of diverse populations. The cultural exchange that emerged from Mongol rule in China created unprecedented opportunities for intellectual and technological development that benefited both civilizations. Chinese scholars gained access to knowledge from across the Mongol Empire, including Islamic scientific texts, European technological innovations, and Central Asian artistic traditions. Mongol administrators learned sophisticated governmental techniques, legal principles, and economic theories that enhanced their ability to govern complex societies. The promotion of trade and cultural exchange under Yuan dynasty rule transformed China's relationship with the broader Eurasian world and established commercial networks that would persist for centuries. The Mongol emphasis on religious tolerance and cultural diversity created an environment where merchants, scholars, and artisans from different backgrounds could interact freely and share their knowledge and skills. This cultural synthesis produced innovations in art, science, and technology that represented the combined achievements of multiple civilizations working together under Mongol patronage. The consolidation of Mongol power across the eastern steppes and the ongoing campaigns against the Jin dynasty had established Temujin, now known as Genghis Khan, as the dominant force in Central Asia by 1218. The Confederation's military machine had evolved into a sophisticated instrument of conquest capable of adapting to diverse terrains and enemy tactics, while the administrative systems codified in the Great Yasa provided the organizational framework necessary for governing vast territories and diverse populations. The western frontiers of the expanding empire now bordered the Khwarezmid Empire, a powerful Islamic state that controlled the lucrative trade routes connecting Central Asia with the Middle East and Europe. The Khwarezmid Empire under Shah Allah ad-Din Muhammad II represented one of the most formidable military and economic powers in the medieval world, controlling territories that extended from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf and from the Caucasus Mountains to the borders of India. The empire's strategic position astride the major trade routes between East and West had generated enormous wealth that supported professional armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, while its diverse population included some of the most skilled craftsmen, scholars, and administrators in the Islamic world. The Khwarezmid military system combined traditional Persian cavalry tactics with Turkish nomadic warfare techniques, creating a hybrid force that had successfully resisted previous invasions from both sedentary and nomadic enemies. The initial relationship between the Mongol Empire and the Khwarezmid state had been characterized by cautious diplomacy and limited commercial exchange rather than open hostility. Genghis Khan understood that his forces were already committed to extensive campaigns against the Jin dynasty and could not afford to open a second major front without careful preparation and strategic planning. The Khwarezmid Shah, meanwhile, viewed the Mongols as another steppe confederation that might prove useful as allies against his own enemies or as a source of military recruits for his expanding armies. The commercial relationship between the two empires initially appeared to offer mutual benefits that could form the foundation for long-term peaceful coexistence. Mongol territories produced valuable raw materials including furs, leather, and livestock that were in high demand in Central Asian markets, while the Khwarezmid Empire controlled access to manufactured goods, spices, and luxury items that the Mongol elite desired. The establishment of regular trade relations required diplomatic negotiations that resulted in formal agreements guaranteeing the safety of merchants and the standardization of commercial practices across the frontier regions. The diplomatic crisis that precipitated the devastating war between the two empires originated in the frontier city of Otrar, a major commercial center located on the Syr Darya River that served as a crucial link in the trade network connecting the Mongol Empire with Central Asian markets. The city's governor, Inalchuk Gair Khan, was a relative of the Khwarezmid Shah, who had been appointed to his position based on family connections rather than administrative competence or diplomatic skill. His authority over Otrar included a responsibility for regulating trade activities, collecting customs duties, and maintaining peaceful relations with neighbouring territories. In 1218, a large Mongol trade caravan arrived in Otrar carrying goods valued at approximately 500,000 gold dinars, representing one of the largest commercial expeditions ever dispatched from Mongol territories. The caravan included over 450 merchants and their attendants, along with substantial quantities of silk, furs, silver, and other valuable commodities that were intended for sale in Central Asian markets. The expedition had been organised with the explicit approval of Genghis Khan, who viewed successful trade relations as essential for maintaining peaceful coexistence with the Khwarezmid Empire while generating revenue needed to support his military campaigns in China. The composition of the trade caravan reflected the cosmopolitan nature of the Mongol Empire's commercial networks, as the expedition included not only Mongol merchants, but also Chinese, Persian, and Arab traders who had established business relationships with Mongol authorities. Several members of the caravan served as informal diplomatic representatives who carried messages from Genghis Khan to the Khwarezmid Shah, while others possessed detailed knowledge of Central Asian political conditions that could provide valuable intelligence about the region's military capabilities and economic resources. Inalchuk's decision to massacre the entire caravan and confiscate its goods represented a catastrophic miscalculation that transformed a routine commercial dispute into a casus belli that would justify total war. The governor's motivations for this action remain unclear, but contemporary sources suggest that he may have been influenced by advisors who viewed the growing Mongol commercial presence as a threat to local economic interests. Alternative explanations include the possibility that Inalchuk suspected some caravan members of serving as spies, or that he simply succumbed to greed and believed he could seize the valuable goods without facing serious consequences. The massacre was carried out with systematic brutality that demonstrated a complete disregard for the diplomatic immunity traditionally accorded to merchants and ambassadors. The caravan members were killed using various methods including beheading, strangulation and burning, while their goods were distributed among Inalchuk's supporters and local officials. The bodies were left unburied as a deliberate insult to Mongol customs, while the few survivors who managed to escape were pursued by cavalry units that attempted to prevent news of the massacre from reaching Mongol territories. The news of the Otrar massacre reached Genghis Khan while he was conducting military operations against Jin dynasty forces in northern China, creating a strategic dilemma that required careful consideration of the empire's military capabilities and political priorities. The Khan's initial response demonstrated his understanding that hasty action could prove counterproductive, as his forces were already committed to extensive campaigns that could not be abandoned without significant strategic costs. However, the magnitude of the provocation made some form of retaliation inevitable, as failure to respond would encourage other enemies to test Mongol resolve and potentially undermine the empire's reputation for invincibility. Genghis Khan's decision to seek diplomatic resolution before resorting to military action reflected his sophisticated understanding of international relations and his recognition that war with the Khwarezmid Empire would require enormous resources and careful preparation. The Khan dispatched a formal embassy to the Khwarezmid court demanding the extradition of Inalchuk for punishment, the payment of compensation for the murdered merchants and confiscated goods, and guarantees that similar incidents would not occur in the future. This diplomatic initiative was designed to provide the Shah with an opportunity to resolve the crisis peacefully, while establishing a clear record of Mongol moderation that could justify more extreme measures if negotiations failed. The Mongol embassy was led by experienced diplomats who possessed detailed knowledge of Islamic customs and Central Asian political traditions, ensuring that their mission would be conducted according to appropriate protocols that could not be dismissed as culturally insensitive or diplomatically inappropriate. The embassy's demands were carefully crafted to offer the Shah a face-saving solution that would satisfy Mongol honour while avoiding the massive disruption that would result from a full-scale war. The compensation requested was substantial, but not impossible to pay, while the extradition demand could potentially be satisfied through symbolic punishment rather than actual execution. Shah Alaa-ad-Din Muhammad's response to the Mongol embassy revealed the fundamental miscalculation that would lead to the destruction of his empire and the deaths of millions of his subjects. Rather than recognizing the diplomatic opportunity presented by the Mongol demands, the Shah chose to escalate the crisis by executing the chief Mongol ambassador and sending the heads of the embassy members back to Genghis Khan. This action violated the most fundamental principles of diplomatic immunity and international law, transforming what had been a commercial dispute into a personal insult that demanded immediate and devastating retaliation. The execution of the Mongol ambassadors represented a declaration of war that eliminated any possibility of peaceful resolution and committed both empires to a conflict that would reshape the political landscape of Central Asia. The Shah's decision may have been influenced by his overconfidence in his military capabilities and his underestimation of Mongol fighting effectiveness, as the Khwarezmid Empire's previous victories against various enemies had created a sense of invincibility that proved to be dangerously misplaced. The execution also reflected the Shah's failure to understand the sophisticated intelligence network that had provided the Mongols with detailed information about Khwarezmid military capabilities and political weaknesses. The Mongol military response to the diplomatic crisis required the redeployment of substantial forces from the Chinese campaigns and the mobilization of additional troops from across the empire's vast territories. Genghis Khan's strategic planning for the Western campaign demonstrated his understanding that success would require not only military victory, but also the complete destruction of the Khwarezmid state's ability to threaten Mongol interests in the future. The campaign objectives included the capture of major cities, the elimination of the Khwarezmid military forces, and the establishment of Mongol administrative control over the empire's territories and trade routes. The logistical challenges of conducting a major military campaign across the vast distances separating Mongol territories from the Khwarezmid Empire required unprecedented coordination and resource management. The Mongol forces needed to transport not only their warriors and equipment, but also the siege engines, artillery pieces, and specialized personnel required for urban warfare. The campaign would involve crossing deserts, mountains, and rivers that presented obstacles far more challenging than anything encountered in previous steppe warfare, requiring new techniques and equipment that could function effectively in diverse environmental conditions. The Mongol army that assembled for the Western campaign represented the largest and most sophisticated military force ever deployed by nomadic peoples, numbering approximately 200,000 warriors supported by extensive auxiliary forces, including engineers, administrators, and specialists recruited from conquered territories. The force included traditional Mongol cavalry units organized according to the decimal system established by the Great Yasa, but also incorporated Chinese siege specialists, Muslim administrators, and various technical experts who possessed knowledge essential for conducting operations in urban environments and diverse terrain conditions. The campaign began in 1219 with a systematic advance that demonstrated the Mongols' sophisticated understanding of strategic warfare and their ability to coordinate multiple army groups across vast distances. Rather than attempting a single massive assault, Genghis Khan divided his forces into several columns that approached Khwarezmid territories from different directions, creating multiple threats that forced the enemy to disperse their defensive forces and prevented effective coordination of resistance efforts. This strategy also allowed the Mongols to gather intelligence about enemy capabilities, while maintaining the flexibility to concentrate their forces at decisive points. The Siege of Bukhara, one of the most important commercial and cultural centers in the Islamic world, demonstrated the evolution of Mongol siege warfare techniques and their ability to adapt Chinese military technology to the requirements of Central Asian urban combat. The city's fortifications included massive walls constructed from baked brick and reinforced with towers and bastions that provided overlapping fields of fire for defending archers and artillery pieces. The defensive system had been designed to withstand traditional siege methods and had successfully resisted previous attacks by various enemies. The Mongol approach to the Bukhara siege combined traditional steppe mobility with sophisticated siege engineering that overwhelmed the city's defenders through coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Mongol engineers constructed elaborate earthworks and wooden fortifications that protected the besieging forces while providing platforms for siege engines and artillery pieces. The siege operations included the use of Chinese catapults and trebuchets that could breach the city's walls. while specialized assault teams equipped with scaling ladders and siege towers attempted to overcome the defensive obstacles. The psychological impact of the Bukhara siege extended beyond the immediate military objectives, as the city's capture demonstrated the Mongols' ability to overcome even the most sophisticated defensive systems. The siege created panic throughout the Khwarezmid Empire, as local officials and military commanders recognized that their fortifications could not protect them from Mongol assault techniques. The city's fall also provided the Mongols with valuable intelligence about Khwarezmid military organization and defensive strategies that proved crucial for subsequent operations. The systematic destruction of Samarkand, the Khwarezmid Empire's capital and one of the most magnificent cities in the medieval world, represented the culmination of Mongol siege warfare development and their commitment to total war against enemies who had violated diplomatic norms. The city's fortifications were among the most advanced in Central Asia, featuring multiple defensive lines, sophisticated artillery positions, and garrison forces numbering in the tens of thousands. The city's capture required the coordination of multiple army groups and the deployment of the most advanced siege equipment available to Mongol forces. The siege operations at Samarkand demonstrated the Mongols' ability to conduct complex urban warfare that combined traditional nomadic tactics with sophisticated engineering techniques. The besieging forces constructed elaborate siege works that surrounded the city with multiple defensive lines, preventing the escape of defenders while maintaining supply routes for the attacking army. The coordination of these construction projects required precise timing and resource management that showcased the effectiveness of the decimal military organization and the integration of Chinese engineering expertise. The capture of Urgench, the Khwarezmid Empire's second most important city, presented unique challenges that required the Mongols to develop new techniques for siege warfare in riverine environments. The city's location on the Amu Darya River provided natural defensive advantages that had been enhanced through the construction of elaborate water-based obstacles and defensive systems. The siege required the Mongols to develop naval capabilities and water-based assault techniques that had not been necessary in previous campaigns. The Urgench siege demonstrated the Mongols' remarkable adaptability and their ability to master new forms of warfare when circumstances required innovation. Mongol engineers diverted the river's flow to eliminate the city's water-based defences while constructing boats and rafts that could transport assault forces across the remaining water obstacles. The siege operations also included the use of Chinese fire weapons and explosive devices that could destroy the city's wooden fortifications and create breaches in the defensive walls. The pursuit of Jalaluddin Mingburnu, the Khwarezmid Shah's son and the most capable military commander in the empire, across Afghanistan and into India, showcased the Mongols' ability to conduct operations in terrain and climate conditions that were completely unfamiliar to steppe peoples. The campaign required the Mongol forces to adapt their tactics and equipment to mountain warfare, desert operations, and tropical conditions that presented challenges far different from anything encountered in previous campaigns. The pursuit also demonstrated the Mongols' commitment to eliminating all potential threats to their empire's security, regardless of the costs and difficulties involved. The mountain warfare techniques developed during the pursuit of Jalal ad-Din required fundamental changes in Mongol military organization and tactical approaches. Traditional steppe cavalry tactics were ineffective in mountainous terrain, where mobility was limited and defensive positions could be easily fortified. Mongol forces needed to develop new capabilities in infantry combat, mountain climbing and siege operations that could succeed against enemies who possessed intimate knowledge of local terrain conditions. The reconnaissance missions conducted by Mongol forces into the Caucasus region during the Western campaigns provided valuable intelligence about European military capabilities and political conditions that would prove crucial for future expansion. These operations, conducted by relatively small forces that could move quickly and avoid detection, gathered detailed information about the military organization, defensive systems, and political relationships of the various kingdoms and principalities that controlled the region. The intelligence gathered during these missions provided the foundation for the strategic planning that would guide subsequent Mongol campaigns into Europe. The Battle of Kalka River in 1223 represented the first major engagement between Mongol forces and European armies, providing both sides with crucial insights into their respective military capabilities and tactical approaches. The battle demonstrated the Mongols' superior mobility and coordination, while revealing the limitations of European heavy cavalry tactics when confronted with disciplined nomadic forces. The engagement also established the Mongols' reputation for military invincibility among European populations, creating psychological advantages that would prove valuable in future campaigns. The Mongol forces that participated in the Khalkha River battle included approximately 20,000 warriors organized into two tumans under the command of Subutai and Jebe, two of Genghis Khan's most experienced and capable generals. These forces had been conducting reconnaissance operations throughout the Caucasus region and had gathered extensive intelligence about the political and military situation in the Russian principalities. The battle occurred when a coalition of Russian princes attempted to intercept the Mongol forces and prevent their return to Central Asia. The tactical approach employed by the Mongol commanders at Khalkha River demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of European military organization and their ability to exploit the weaknesses of heavy cavalry formations. The Mongols used their superior mobility to avoid direct confrontation with the heavily armoured European knights, while employing their composite bows to inflict casualties from distances that European weapons could not match. The battle also showcased the effectiveness of Mongol coordination and communication systems that allowed widely separated units to execute complex tactical maneuvers with precise timing. The success of the Khalkha River engagement provided the Mongol High Command with invaluable intelligence about European military capabilities and political structures that would prove crucial for the systematic conquest campaigns that followed. The reconnaissance operations conducted by Subutai and Jebe had revealed the fundamental weaknesses of the Russian principalities: their chronic political fragmentation, outdated military tactics, and inability to coordinate effective resistance against mobile enemy forces. This intelligence reached Genghis Khan during the final phases of the Khwarezmid campaigns, where it was analysed by his Strategic Planning Council and incorporated into long-term expansion plans for the empire's western frontiers. The political landscape of Eastern Europe in the 1230s presented opportunities that experienced steppe commanders could exploit with devastating effectiveness. The Russian principalities existed in a state of perpetual conflict, with major centres like Moscow, Kiev, Vladimir, and Novgorod maintaining separate military forces and pursuing independent diplomatic policies that often conflicted with their neighbours' interests. The Orthodox Christian princes frequently engaged in internecine warfare over succession disputes, territorial boundaries, and commercial privileges, creating a fragmented political environment that made unified resistance against external threats virtually impossible. The appointment of Batu Khan as commander of the European campaigns reflected the Mongol Empire's systematic approach to military leadership, and their understanding that successful conquest required commanders who possessed both tactical expertise and political acumen. Batu, a grandson of Genghis Khan through his father Yochi, had demonstrated exceptional military capabilities during the final phases of the Khwarezmid campaigns and possessed the political authority necessary to coordinate the activities of multiple army groups across vast distances. His appointment also reflected the empire's succession planning, as successful command of major campaigns served as preparation for future leadership responsibilities within the imperial hierarchy. The military force assembled for the European campaigns represented the culmination of Mongol organisational development and their ability to coordinate resources from across their vast empire. The expedition included approximately 150,000 warriors organised into 15 tumans, supported by extensive auxiliary forces including Chinese siege engineers, Muslim administrators, and various technical specialists recruited from conquered territories. The force also included substantial numbers of horses, with each warrior maintaining a string of 3 to 5 mounts that provided the mobility advantages essential for steppe warfare tactics. The logistical planning for the European campaigns required unprecedented coordination between multiple administrative centres and demonstrated the effectiveness of the communication systems established throughout the Mongol Empire. Supply depots were established at strategic locations along the anticipated route of advance, while advance teams prepared river crossings, identified suitable pasture areas for the vast horse herds, and gathered intelligence about enemy defensive preparations. The planning process also included detailed analysis of seasonal weather patterns, as the campaign's success would depend on the ability to exploit winter conditions that European armies considered prohibitive for military operations. The systematic conquest of the Russian principalities began in 1237, with coordinated attacks against multiple targets that prevented effective enemy coordination and demonstrated the Mongols' ability to conduct simultaneous operations across vast distances. Rather than concentrating their forces against a single major city, Batu Khan divided his armies into several columns that approached different principalities from multiple directions, creating the impression of overwhelming numerical superiority, while forcing Russian commanders to disperse their defensive forces among numerous threatened locations. The siege of Ryazan, the first major Russian city to face Mongol assault, established the tactical patterns that would characterize the entire campaign and demonstrated the evolution of Mongol siege warfare techniques since the Chinese and Central Asian campaigns. The city's fortifications consisted of wooden palisades reinforced with earthworks and stone foundations, defensive systems that had proven effective against traditional European siege methods but were inadequate against the sophisticated assault techniques developed by Mongol engineers. The siege operations included the construction of the elaborate earthworks that surrounded the city with multiple defensive lines, preventing the escape of defenders while providing platforms for siege engines and artillery pieces. The Mongol approach to the Ryazan siege combined traditional steppe mobility with advanced siege engineering that overwhelmed the city's defenders through coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Chinese siege specialists constructed catapults and trebuchets that could breach the city's wooden walls, while specialized assault teams equipped with scaling ladders and siege towers attempted to overcome the defensive obstacles. The siege also included the use of psychological warfare techniques, including the deliberate massacre of captured defenders and the display of their bodies as warnings to other cities that might consider resistance. The capture of Ryazan within 5 days of the siege's commencement sent shockwaves throughout the Russian principalities and demonstrated the futility of attempting to resist Mongol forces using traditional defensive strategies. The city's rapid fall contradicted European assumptions about siege warfare duration and revealed the technological advantages that Mongol forces possessed through their integration of Chinese military engineering. The massacre of Ryazan's population, conducted with systematic brutality that left no survivors, established the Mongols' reputation for ruthlessness and encouraged other cities to consider surrender rather than face similar destruction. The winter campaign strategy employed by Batu Khan represented a revolutionary approach to European warfare that exploited environmental conditions that local commanders considered prohibitive for military operations. Traditional European military practice avoided major campaigns during winter months, when frozen ground made cavalry operations difficult and supply shortages could devastate armies far from their bases. The Mongols transformed these apparent disadvantages into strategic assets by using frozen rivers as highways for rapid movement and exploiting the enemy's seasonal military inactivity to achieve tactical surprise. The utilization of frozen rivers as transportation routes required careful planning and specialized equipment that demonstrated the Mongols' adaptability to diverse environmental conditions. Mongol engineers developed techniques for testing ice thickness and identifying safe crossing points, while specialized units cleared snow and obstacles from river surfaces to create smooth pathways for cavalry movement. The frozen rivers provided direct routes to target cities that bypassed the defensive obstacles and difficult terrain that protected these settlements during warmer months. The psychological impact of winter warfare extended beyond the immediate tactical advantages, as European populations viewed military campaigns during the coldest months as violations of natural law and divine will. The appearance of Mongol armies during blizzards and extreme cold temperatures created supernatural fears that undermined enemy morale and encouraged defections among defending forces. The Mongols' apparent immunity to weather conditions that paralyzed European armies enhanced their reputation for invincibility and contributed to the rapid collapse of organized resistance. The siege of Moscow in 1238 demonstrated the Mongols' ability to adapt their siege techniques to the specific challenges presented by different types of fortifications and defensive systems. Moscow's fortifications included a wooden Kremlin surrounded by earthworks and protected by natural obstacles, including the Moskva River and surrounding marshlands. The city's defenders had attempted to strengthen their position by flooding the approaches and creating additional water obstacles, but these measures proved ineffective against Mongol engineering capabilities. The Mongol assault on Moscow began with the construction of elaborate siege works that surrounded the city with multiple defensive lines and provided platforms for siege engines and artillery pieces. Chinese engineers directed the construction of catapults and trebuchets that could breach the city's wooden walls, while specialized assault teams prepared scaling ladders and siege towers for the final assault. The siege operations also included the use of fire weapons and incendiary devices that could destroy the city's wooden structures and create panic among the defending population. The capture of Moscow after a siege lasting only 4 days demonstrated the effectiveness of Mongol siege techniques and their ability to overcome defensive systems that had previously been considered impregnable. The city's rapid fall shocked the remaining Russian principalities and convinced many local commanders that resistance was futile. The systematic destruction of Moscow's population and infrastructure served as a warning to other cities while eliminating a potential center of future resistance to Mongol rule. The advance toward Vladimir, the capital of the most powerful Russian principality, required the coordination of multiple army groups and demonstrated the Mongols' ability to conduct complex operations across vast distances during the most challenging weather conditions. The campaign took place during the harshest winter months, when temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius and blizzards made movement extremely difficult for traditional European forces. The Mongols' superior cold weather equipment and their horses' adaptation to extreme conditions provided crucial advantages that enabled them to maintain operational effectiveness when enemy forces were paralyzed by weather. The Siege of Vladimir in February 1238 represented the climactic engagement of the northern campaign and demonstrated the full range of Mongol siege warfare capabilities. The city's fortifications included stone walls reinforced with wooden palisades, multiple defensive lines, and a citadel that could serve as a final refuge for the defending forces. The city's garrison included professional soldiers from throughout the principality, supported by militia forces and civilian volunteers who were determined to resist the Mongol advance. The Mongol assault on Vladimir began with a comprehensive blockade that prevented the entry of supplies and reinforcements, while Mongol engineers constructed the siege works necessary for a direct assault. The siege operations included the use of Chinese artillery pieces that could breach the city's stone walls, while specialized assault teams prepared for coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The siege also included psychological warfare techniques, including the display of captured prisoners and the systematic destruction of surrounding settlements to demonstrate the consequences of continued resistance. The capture of Vladimir after a siege lasting 6 days eliminated the last major center of organized resistance in the northern Russian principalities and opened the route toward Novgorod, the wealthy commercial center that controlled trade routes connecting Russia with Western Europe. The city's fall was followed by the systematic massacre of its population and the destruction of its religious and cultural monuments, actions designed to eliminate any potential focus for future resistance movements. The destruction of Vladimir's libraries and churches represented a cultural catastrophe that eliminated centuries of accumulated knowledge and artistic achievement. The campaign against Kiev, the ancient capital of the Russian principalities and the most important Orthodox Christian center in Eastern Europe, required different tactical approaches due to the city's massive fortifications and its symbolic importance to Russian identity. Kiev's defences included stone walls that rose over 15 meters in height, reinforced with numerous towers and bastions that provided overlapping fields of fire for defending archers and artillery pieces. The city's population exceeded 50,000 people, making it one of the largest urban centres in Eastern Europe, and a prize that would demonstrate Mongol dominance over the entire region. The Siege of Kiev in 1240 represented the culmination of Mongol siege warfare development and their ability to overcome the most sophisticated defensive systems in Europe. The siege operations required the coordination of multiple army groups totaling over 60,000 warriors, supported by extensive auxiliary forces including Chinese siege specialists, Muslim administrators, and various technical experts. The siege works constructed around Kiev included elaborate earthworks and wooden fortifications that surrounded the city with multiple defensive lines, while specialized siege engines were positioned to breach the city's massive stone walls. The Mongol assault on Kiev began with a systematic bombardment using Chinese catapults and trebuchets that could hurl stones weighing over 100 kilograms against the city's walls. The artillery barrage continued for several days, creating multiple breaches in the defensive walls while causing panic among the defending population. The siege also included the use of fire weapons and incendiary devices that destroyed wooden structures within the city and created additional chaos among the defenders. The final assault on Kiev involved coordinated attacks from multiple directions that overwhelmed the city's defenders and demonstrated the effectiveness of Mongol tactical coordination. Assault teams equipped with scaling ladders and siege towers attacked the breached sections of the walls, while other units attempted to capture the city's gates and towers. The assault was supported by continuous artillery bombardment that prevented the defenders from organizing effective counterattacks or repairing the damaged fortifications. The capture of Kiev after a siege lasting 9 days represented the complete conquest of the Russian principalities and eliminated the last major center of Orthodox Christian resistance to Mongol expansion. The city's fall was followed by systematic destruction that exceeded even the devastation inflicted on other conquered cities, as the Mongols recognized Kiev's symbolic importance and sought to eliminate any potential focus for future resistance movements. The massacre of Kiev's population was conducted with particular brutality, with contemporary sources reporting that the city's streets were littered with corpses for months after the conquest. The advance into Hungary and Poland in 1241 represented the extension of Mongol conquest into the heart of medieval Europe, and demonstrated their ability to adapt their military techniques to the challenges presented by different terrain and enemy tactics. The campaign required the coordination of multiple army groups that approached Central Europe from different directions, creating multiple threats that forced European commanders to disperse their defensive forces and prevented effective coordination of resistance efforts. The Battle of Mohi in April 1241 demonstrated the tactical superiority of Mongol forces over the heavily armoured European cavalry that represented the pinnacle of medieval military technology. The Hungarian army that assembled to face the Mongol invasion included approximately 60,000 warriors, featuring heavily armoured knights supported by crossbow infantry and various auxiliary forces recruited from throughout the kingdom. The Hungarian commanders had positioned their forces in a fortified camp protected by wagons and earthworks, believing that these defensive measures would neutralize the Mongols' mobility advantages. The Mongol tactical approach at Mohi combined traditional steppe warfare techniques with innovative adaptations designed to exploit the specific weaknesses of European heavy cavalry formations. Batu Khan divided his forces into multiple columns that approached the Hungarian position from different directions, creating the impression of overwhelming numerical superiority while preventing effective enemy coordination. The Mongol forces included specialized units equipped with Chinese siege engines that could breach the Hungarian fortifications, while traditional cavalry units prepared to exploit any gaps in the enemy formation. The battle began with a coordinated assault that demonstrated the effectiveness of Mongol tactical coordination and their ability to execute complex maneuvers under combat conditions. Mongol engineers used Chinese catapults to destroy sections of the Hungarian wagon fortifications, while cavalry units conducted feigned retreats designed to lure enemy forces into vulnerable positions. The Hungarian knights, trained in traditional European tactics that emphasized individual combat prowess, proved unable to adapt to the Mongols' coordinated approach and sophisticated tactical deception. The destruction of the Hungarian army at Mohi eliminated the last major military force capable of organized resistance to Mongol expansion in Central Europe, and opened the route toward Western European territories. The battle's outcome demonstrated the obsolescence of traditional European military tactics when confronted with the sophisticated warfare techniques developed by Mongol forces through their campaigns across Asia. The Hungarian defeat also revealed the limitations of European intelligence gathering and strategic planning, as the Hungarian commanders had seriously underestimated Mongol capabilities and tactical sophistication. The simultaneous Battle of Legnica in Poland demonstrated the Mongols' ability to conduct coordinated operations across vast distances and their success in adapting their tactics to different types of European military organization. The Polish and German forces that assembled to face the Mongol invasion included heavily armored knights from various military orders supported by crossbow infantry and militia forces recruited from throughout the region. The European commanders had attempted to coordinate their strategy with the Hungarian forces, but communication difficulties and the speed of Mongol movement prevented effective cooperation between the two armies. The tactical approach employed by the Mongol forces at Legnica showcased their ability to exploit the psychological weaknesses of European military formations and their sophisticated understanding of enemy command structures. The Mongol commanders used their superior mobility to avoid direct confrontation with the heavily armoured European knights, while employing their composite bows to inflict casualties from distances that European weapons could not match. The battle also demonstrated the effectiveness of Mongol coordination and communication systems that allowed widely separated units to execute complex tactical maneuvers with precise timing. The destruction of the Polish and German forces at Legnica eliminated another major obstacle to Mongol expansion and demonstrated their ability to defeat the most advanced military formations that medieval Europe could deploy. The battle's outcome shocked European courts and convinced many rulers that traditional military tactics were inadequate for confronting the Mongol threat. The defeat also revealed the limitations of European military technology and tactical doctrine when confronted with enemies who possessed superior mobility, coordination, and strategic planning capabilities. The sudden withdrawal of Mongol forces from Central Europe following the death of Ogedai Khan in December 1241 represented one of the most significant turning points in medieval European history and demonstrated the importance of centralized leadership within the Mongol Empire's political structure. The news of the Great Khan's death reached Batu Khan while his forces were preparing for campaigns against Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, operations that would have extended Mongol conquest into the heart of Western Europe. The succession crisis that followed Ogedai's death required the presence of all major Mongol commanders at the Kurultai that would select the new Great Khan, forcing the suspension of European campaigns at the moment of their greatest success. The strategic withdrawal from Europe was conducted with the same systematic efficiency that had characterized the conquest campaigns, demonstrating the Mongols' ability to maintain discipline and coordination even during periods of political uncertainty. The withdrawal operations included the evacuation of siege equipment, the organization of supply trains, and the coordination of multiple army groups across vast distances. The Mongol forces also conducted systematic destruction of military installations and infrastructure that could support future European resistance efforts, ensuring that their temporary withdrawal would not encourage immediate counterattacks. The long-term impact of the Mongol withdrawal on European political development was profound and lasting, as the experience of facing near conquest forced European rulers to reconsider their military organization, diplomatic strategies, and political structures. The Mongol campaigns had demonstrated the obsolescence of traditional feudal military systems and the need for more centralized command structures that could coordinate resistance efforts across multiple kingdoms and principalities. The threat of renewed Mongol invasion also encouraged European technological innovation and military reform that would eventually contribute to the development of more effective defensive capabilities. The withdrawal of Mongol forces from Central Europe following Ogedai Khan's death marked the beginning of a new phase in the empire's development, one characterized by consolidation rather than conquest. The vast territories stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean required sophisticated administrative systems that could maintain stability while facilitating the unprecedented cultural and commercial exchange that would define the Pax Mongolica. The Mongol Empire's transformation from a purely military organization into a complex governmental structure capable of governing diverse populations across multiple continents represented one of the most remarkable administrative achievements in human history. The establishment of the Silk Road's Golden Age under Mongol protection created the most extensive and secure trade network the world had ever known, connecting civilizations that had previously maintained only sporadic contact through dangerous and unreliable routes. The Mongol Empire's control over territories spanning from the Black Sea to the Yellow Sea eliminated the fragmented political authorities that had previously imposed arbitrary taxes, demanded bribes, and provided inadequate protection for merchant caravans. Under Mongol rule, a single administrative framework governed the entire length of the Silk Road, standardizing commercial practices, establishing uniform currency exchange rates, and guaranteeing the safety of merchants regardless of their ethnic or religious backgrounds. The volume of trade that flowed along the Silk Road during the Mongol period exceeded anything previously recorded in human history, with caravans numbering in the thousands of camels and carrying goods valued in the millions of silver taels. Chinese silk, porcelain and tea moved westward in quantities that transformed European and Middle Eastern markets, while Islamic textiles, spices and precious stones travelled eastward to satisfy the growing demand among Chinese and Mongol elites. The standardization of weights, measures and currency denominations across the empire eliminated the complex conversion processes that had previously made long-distance trade prohibitively expensive and risky. The Mongol approach to commercial regulation represented a sophisticated understanding of economic principles that encouraged trade while generating substantial revenue for the imperial treasury. Rather than imposing heavy taxes that would discourage commercial activity, the Mongols established a system of moderate but consistent tariffs that provided predictable costs for merchants while ensuring steady income for the government. The standardization of these commercial practices across the empire's vast territories eliminated the confusion and uncertainty that had previously plagued international trade, creating conditions that encouraged merchants to undertake longer and more ambitious trading expeditions. The protection provided to merchant caravans under Mongol rule involved more than simple military escorts, encompassing a comprehensive security system that included intelligence networks, emergency supply depots, and specialized rescue units capable of responding to various threats. The Mongol military maintained regular patrols along major trade routes, while local commanders received explicit instructions to treat attacks on merchant caravans as acts of rebellion against imperial authority. The empire's reputation for swift and brutal retaliation against bandits and raiders created a deterrent effect that made the Silk Road safer than it had been for centuries. The revolutionary postal system known as the Yam represented perhaps the most sophisticated communication network in the pre-modern world, enabling rapid transmission of information across distances that had previously required months to traverse. The system consisted of relay stations positioned approximately 25 to 30 kilometers apart along major routes, each maintained by local authorities and stocked with fresh horses, supplies and personnel trained in the handling of official correspondence. The stations were strategically located to provide shelter and provisions for imperial messengers while maintaining the infrastructure necessary for continuous operation regardless of weather conditions or seasonal variations. The Yam's operational efficiency depended on a complex hierarchy of personnel trained in specific aspects of message transmission and route management. Station masters, typically recruited from local populations but answerable to imperial authorities, maintained detailed records of all messages passing through their facilities and ensured that relay horses remained in optimal condition for immediate deployment. Specialized messengers, known as uliki, underwent rigorous training in horsemanship, navigation and emergency procedures that enabled them to maintain communication links even under adverse conditions. The speed of communication achieved through the Yam system was unprecedented in the medieval world, with urgent messages capable of travelling from Beijing to Karakorum in less than 2 weeks, and from Karakorum to Kiev in approximately 3 weeks. This communication capability provided Mongol administrators with near real-time information about conditions throughout the empire, enabling rapid responses to political crises, natural disasters, and military threats. The system also facilitated commercial activities by allowing merchants to coordinate their operations across vast distances and receive timely information about market conditions, political developments, and potential hazards. The Yam's military applications extended beyond simple message transmission to include the coordination of troop movements, intelligence gathering, and strategic planning across multiple theatres of operation. Military commanders could communicate directly with the imperial court and receive updated orders based on changing strategic circumstances, while intelligence reports from frontier regions provided early warning of potential threats. The system's reliability and speed gave Mongol forces significant advantages in military coordination that contributed to their continued dominance over potential rivals. The maintenance of the Yam system required substantial resources and careful organisation, with local populations bearing responsibility for providing horses, supplies, and personnel in exchange for exemption from certain taxes and military service obligations. The system's operation was governed by detailed regulations that specified the quality of horses to be maintained, the quantities of supplies to be stockpiled, and the training requirements for personnel. Regular inspections ensured that stations maintained the standards necessary for efficient operation, while penalties for negligence or sabotage were severe enough to discourage interference with the system's functioning. The policy of religious tolerance implemented throughout the Mongol Empire created an unprecedented environment of spiritual diversity that protected practitioners of all major faiths while utilizing religious leaders as intermediaries in the imperial administration. The Mongols' pragmatic approach to religious matters reflected their understanding that forced conversion would create unnecessary resistance and undermine the stability of their diverse empire. Instead, they established a framework that guaranteed religious freedom while requiring all faiths to acknowledge the supreme authority of the Great Khan and contribute to the empire's governance. The protection extended to Christian communities throughout the empire enabled the expansion of Nestorian Christianity into regions where it had previously faced persecution or restriction. Nestorian churches were established in major cities along the Silk Road, providing spiritual services to Christian merchants and diplomats, while serving as centres for theological scholarship and cultural exchange. The Mongol court's openness to Christian influence was demonstrated by the appointment of Christian advisors to high-ranking positions and the marriage of several Mongol princes to Christian princesses from various kingdoms. Islamic communities within the Mongol Empire maintained their religious practices and legal traditions while adapting to the requirements of imperial administration. Muslim scholars and administrators played crucial roles in the empire's governmental structure, particularly in regions with large Islamic populations, where their cultural knowledge and linguistic skills proved invaluable. The Mongols' respect for Islamic learning was demonstrated by their patronage of madrasas and libraries, while Muslim merchants continued to dominate trade networks that connected the empire with the broader Islamic world. Buddhist communities, particularly those following Tibetan traditions, established special relationships with Mongol rulers that would influence imperial policy for generations. The Mongols' interest in Buddhist philosophy and ritual practices led to the appointment of Buddhist monks as spiritual advisors, while Tibetan lamas gained significant influence over imperial decision-making. The empire's support for Buddhist institutions facilitated the construction of monasteries and temples throughout Mongol territories, creating centers of learning that preserved and transmitted Buddhist teachings across cultural boundaries. The integration of Taoist and Confucian traditions into the empire's administrative framework reflected the Mongols' pragmatic approach to governing Chinese populations while maintaining their own cultural identity. Taoist masters provided spiritual guidance and medical knowledge that proved valuable to Mongol elites, while Confucian scholars contributed administrative expertise and governmental theory that enhanced the empire's bureaucratic efficiency. The synthesis of these diverse philosophical traditions created a unique intellectual environment that encouraged scholarly exchange and philosophical innovation. The cultural and technological exchange facilitated by Mongol rule created unprecedented opportunities for the transmission of knowledge and innovation across civilizational boundaries. The empire's vast territories and secure communication networks enabled scholars, craftsmen, and inventors to share their discoveries with colleagues thousands of kilometers away, accelerating the pace of technological development and cultural synthesis. The Mongols' policy of relocating skilled specialists to regions where their expertise was most needed further enhanced this process of knowledge transfer. The transmission of gunpowder technology from China to the Islamic world and Europe represented one of the most significant technological transfers in human history, fundamentally altering the nature of warfare and engineering throughout Eurasia. Chinese alchemists and military engineers working under Mongol patronage developed increasingly sophisticated explosive devices and firearms that were subsequently adapted by Islamic and European specialists. The Mongol military's adoption of gunpowder weapons accelerated their development and deployment, while the empire's trade networks facilitated the spread of both the technology and the raw materials necessary for its production. Printing technology, originally developed in China during the Tang dynasty, experienced rapid advancement and geographic expansion under Mongol rule. The empire's administrative needs for standardized documents, legal codes, and religious texts created demand for efficient reproduction methods that encouraged innovation in printing techniques. The establishment of printing workshops in major cities throughout the empire facilitated the production of books in multiple languages and scripts, while the standardization of paper production techniques enabled the creation of uniform documents across vast territories. The development and transmission of navigational instruments, particularly the magnetic compass and advanced astronomical devices, revolutionized maritime trade and exploration throughout the Mongol period. Chinese navigational technology, refined through centuries of experience in riverine and coastal navigation, was adapted for use in the Indian Ocean and Mediterranean Sea through collaboration with Arab and Persian maritime specialists. The Mongol Empire's control over both overland and maritime trade routes created opportunities for the exchange of navigational knowledge that enhanced the safety and efficiency of long-distance commerce. Medical knowledge and pharmaceutical techniques experienced unprecedented development and dissemination under Mongol patronage, as the empire's diverse populations contributed their traditional healing practices to a growing body of medical literature. Chinese medical texts were translated into Persian and Arabic, while Islamic medical treatises were rendered into Chinese and Mongolian. The establishment of medical schools in major cities throughout the empire created centers for the training of physicians who combined knowledge from multiple medical traditions, resulting in more effective treatments and surgical techniques. The Mongol court's patronage of scholars and intellectuals from diverse backgrounds created an environment that encouraged intellectual exchange and innovation across traditional cultural boundaries. The Imperial Library at Karakorum contained texts in dozens of languages and scripts, while the court's translation projects made important works available to scholars who would otherwise have been unable to access them. The presence of Chinese, Islamic, Christian, and Buddhist scholars at the imperial court facilitated discussions and debates that contributed to advances in philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and other fields of knowledge. The establishment of educational institutions throughout the empire reflected the Mongols' recognition that effective governance required educated administrators capable of managing complex bureaucratic systems. Schools were established in major cities to train civil servants in the languages, legal systems, and administrative procedures necessary for imperial service. These institutions combined traditional Mongol values with the scholarly traditions of conquered peoples, creating a unique educational synthesis that prepared administrators for service in the empire's diverse territories. The economic policies implemented by the Mongol Empire created conditions that encouraged innovation and entrepreneurship, while maintaining the stability necessary for long-term development. The standardization of currency systems across the empire eliminated the complex exchange processes that had previously hindered long-distance trade, while the establishment of banking networks facilitated the transfer of funds across vast distances. The empire's support for technological innovation was demonstrated by the establishment of workshops and research centers that encouraged experimentation and development in various fields. The agricultural improvements implemented throughout the empire reflected the Mongols' understanding that food security was essential for maintaining stability in their vast territories. Chinese agricultural techniques were introduced to regions where they could increase crop yields, while irrigation systems developed in Central Asia were adapted for use in other environments. The empire's support for agricultural innovation included the establishment of experimental farms and the distribution of new crop varieties that could thrive in different climatic conditions. The development of manufacturing techniques and industrial processes under Mongol rule created new opportunities for economic growth and technological advancement. The empire's control over raw material sources and trade routes enabled the establishment of manufacturing centers that could produce goods for distribution throughout Eurasia. The standardization of production techniques and quality control measures ensured that manufactured goods met consistent standards regardless of their place of origin, facilitating trade and enhancing consumer confidence. The preservation and transmission of cultural traditions throughout the empire reflected the Mongols' recognition that cultural diversity was a source of strength rather than weakness. The imperial court's patronage of artists, musicians, and writers from various backgrounds created opportunities for cultural exchange that enriched the artistic traditions of all participating civilizations. The establishment of cultural centers in major cities provided venues for the performance and preservation of traditional arts, while encouraging innovation and experimentation. The death of Mongol Khan in August 1259 during the siege of Diaoyu Castle in Sichuan province created a succession crisis that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the Mongol Empire and mark the beginning of its transformation from a unified imperial structure into a collection of competing regional powers. The circumstances surrounding Möngke's death remain disputed among contemporary sources, with some accounts suggesting he succumbed to dysentery while others indicate he died from wounds sustained during the siege operations. Regardless of the specific cause, his unexpected demise occurred at a critical moment when Mongol forces were engaged in simultaneous campaigns across multiple fronts, requiring immediate decisions about military command and political succession that would determine the empire's future direction. The succession dispute that erupted between Kublai Khan and his younger brother, Arik Boka, represented more than a simple dynastic conflict, embodying fundamental disagreements about the empire's future development and the appropriate balance between traditional Mongol values and the administrative requirements of governing sedentary populations. Kublai, who had been commanding Mongol forces in southern China and had established his headquarters at Kaiping, represented the faction that favoured continued expansion and the adoption of Chinese governmental practices that could enhance administrative efficiency. His extensive experience in Chinese territories had convinced him that successful rule over agricultural populations required sophisticated, bureaucratic institutions and cultural accommodation that went beyond traditional Mongol administrative methods. Arik Boka, who controlled the imperial capital at Karakorum and commanded the loyalty of many traditional Mongol nobles, represented the conservative faction that sought to preserve the empire's nomadic character and maintain the political structures that had enabled the original conquests. His supporters argued that excessive adaptation to Chinese customs would undermine the military virtues and cultural identity that had made Mongol expansion possible, while the adoption of sedentary governmental practices would create dependencies that could weaken the empire's capacity for continued conquest. The geographical division between the two claimants reflected deeper ideological differences about the empire's proper relationship with conquered civilizations and the extent to which Mongol culture should adapt to local conditions. The civil war that began in 1260 involved military campaigns across thousands of kilometers and required both claimants to mobilize resources from their respective territorial bases while attempting to secure recognition from other members of the imperial family. Kublai's position in China provided him with access to the empire's wealthiest provinces and most sophisticated administrative apparatus, enabling him to finance extended military operations while maintaining the complex logistics necessary for large-scale warfare. His control over Chinese agricultural regions also provided reliable food supplies for his armies, while the empire's manufacturing centres could produce weapons and equipment in quantities that exceeded anything available to his opponents. Arik Boka's control over the traditional Mongol heartland provided him with symbolic legitimacy and access to the tribal levies that had formed the backbone of the original Mongol military system. The steppes remained the primary source of cavalry mounts and experienced nomadic warriors, while Karakorum's position at the centre of the empire's communication networks initially gave him advantages in coordinating with other regional commanders. However, the economic limitations of the steppe environment made it difficult to sustain prolonged military campaigns, particularly when facing opponents who possessed superior financial resources and manufacturing capabilities. The military campaigns of the Succession War demonstrated the evolution of Mongol warfare techniques and the increasing importance of siege operations, logistics, and coordinated strategy over the traditional emphasis on cavalry mobility and individual combat prowess. Both sides employed Chinese siege engineers and artillery specialists who had become integral components of Mongol military organisation, while the recruitment of local auxiliary forces reflected the empire's growing dependence on non-Mongol military personnel. The campaigns also revealed the limitations of the traditional decimal military organisation when applied to conflicts involving political loyalty and regional identity, rather than external conquest. The decisive engagement occurred in 1264 when Kublai's forces, supported by Chinese allies and equipped with superior siege equipment, successfully captured Karakorum after a prolonged campaign that demonstrated the effectiveness of combining traditional Mongol mobility with Chinese technological advantages. The fall of the traditional capital eliminated Arik Boka's primary power base and forced him to seek refuge with allies in the western regions of the empire, where his presence continued to complicate political relationships and encourage regional autonomy. The capture of Karakorum also provided Kublai with control over the empire's symbolic centre and the administrative apparatus that had coordinated imperial activities since Ogadai Khan's reign. Arik Boka's eventual surrender in 1264 formally ended the civil war, but failed to restore the empire's previous unity, as the prolonged conflict had encouraged regional commanders to pursue independent policies and had demonstrated the practical difficulties of maintaining centralized control over such vast territories. The war's conclusion left Kublai as the recognized Great Khan, but his authority was effectively limited to the empire's eastern regions, while the western territories had developed autonomous governmental structures that acknowledged his theoretical supremacy while maintaining practical independence. The precedent established by the Succession War would influence subsequent political developments throughout the empire and contribute to the emergence of distinct regional identities that transcended traditional tribal affiliations. The establishment of the Yuan dynasty in 1271 represented Kublai Khan's formal adoption of Chinese imperial traditions and his recognition that effective governance of China required institutional structures that could accommodate Chinese political expectations while maintaining Mongol military supremacy. The new dynasty's governmental apparatus combined elements of traditional Chinese bureaucracy with Mongol administrative practices, creating a hybrid system that attempted to balance the needs of both ruling and subject populations. The Yuan administrative structure included Chinese-style ministries responsible for taxation, justice, and public works, while military command remained concentrated in the hands of Mongol nobles who maintained their traditional privileges and cultural practices. The Yuan dynasty's capital at Dadu, constructed on the site of the former Jin dynasty capital of Zhongdu, represented a massive urban planning project that demonstrated the dynasty's commitment to establishing a permanent administrative centre capable of governing the world's most populous empire. The city's design incorporated both Chinese architectural traditions and Mongol preferences for open spaces and accessibility, creating a unique urban environment that reflected the cultural synthesis that characterized Yuan rule. The construction project required the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of workers and the coordination of resources from throughout the empire, showcasing the administrative capabilities that had developed under Mongol rule. The Yuan dynasty's economic policies reflected Kublai Khan's understanding that China's agricultural and commercial wealth provided the foundation for imperial power and required careful management to maintain productivity while generating revenue for military and administrative expenses. The dynasty implemented a comprehensive taxation system that combined traditional Chinese land taxes with commercial levies designed to capture revenue from the expanding trade networks that connected China with the broader Mongol Empire. The standardization of currency and the establishment of state monopolies over salt and iron production provided additional sources of income while maintaining governmental control over essential commodities. The cultural policies of the Yuan dynasty demonstrated the complex challenges of governing a Chinese population while maintaining Mongol identity and political supremacy. The dynasty's educational system preserved Chinese scholarly traditions while incorporating Mongol perspectives on governance and military affairs, creating opportunities for cultural exchange that enriched both traditions. The imperial court's patronage of Chinese artists and scholars encouraged the continuation of traditional cultural practices while providing venues for innovation and experimentation that reflected the dynasty's cosmopolitan character. The emergence of the Ilkhanate in Persia represented another significant development in the empire's fragmentation, as Hulagu Khan's conquest of the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258 had established Mongol control over the Islamic world's traditional centre, while creating new challenges for governing Muslim populations. The Ilkhanate's territorial extent included modern-day Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and parts of Central Asia, encompassing some of the world's most sophisticated urban centres and agricultural regions. The conquest of Baghdad and the destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate had eliminated the symbolic centre of Sunni Islamic authority, creating opportunities for the Mongols to establish new forms of legitimacy while managing the complex religious and cultural dynamics of Islamic society. Hulagu's establishment of the Ilkhanate's capital at Tabriz reflected strategic considerations about controlling the region's trade routes and administrative networks, while maintaining connections with the broader Mongol Empire. Tabriz's location provided access to the commercial networks, that connected the Islamic world with Europe and Central Asia, while its distance from traditional Islamic centres reduced the influence of established religious authorities who might oppose Mongol rule. The city's development under Ilkhanate patronage included the construction of palaces, mosques, and educational institutions that reflected the dynasty's commitment to establishing permanent governmental structures adapted to local conditions. The Ilkhanate's military organisation combined traditional Mongol cavalry units with local forces that possessed expertise in the specific combat requirements of Middle Eastern warfare. The integration of Persian and Arab military specialists provided knowledge of siege warfare techniques, urban combat methods, and the logistical requirements for campaigns in arid environments that differed significantly from the steppe conditions where traditional Mongol tactics had been developed. The Ilkhanate's forces also included contingents from various ethnic groups throughout the region, creating a diverse military structure that reflected the empire's multicultural character. The administrative challenges faced by the Ilkhanate included the need to govern populations with sophisticated legal traditions and established governmental institutions that had developed over centuries of Islamic rule. The Mongol approach involved the preservation of existing administrative structures while introducing new elements that could enhance efficiency and ensure loyalty to the new regime. Persian administrators who demonstrated competence and reliability were retained in their positions, while Mongol nobles assumed supervisory roles that provided oversight without disrupting established procedures. The religious policies of the Ilkhanate reflected the complex dynamics of governing Muslim populations while maintaining Mongol religious traditions and accommodating the diverse faiths represented within the empire's territories. The initial period of Ilkhanate rule was characterized by religious tolerance and the protection of various communities, including Christians, Jews, and Muslims, while Mongol rulers maintained their traditional shamanistic practices and Buddhist influences. This religious diversity created opportunities for cultural exchange and intellectual development that enriched the region's scholarly traditions. The gradual conversion of Ilkhanate rulers to Islam represented a significant transformation that reflected both practical political considerations and genuine religious conviction. The conversion process began with individual rulers who recognized that adopting Islam would enhance their legitimacy among Muslim subjects while providing access to the sophisticated legal and administrative traditions that had developed within Islamic civilization. The formal conversion of Genghis Khan in 1295 marked a turning point in the Ilkhanate's development, as it signalled the dynasty's commitment to Islamic identity while maintaining its Mongol political structure. The impact of Islamic conversion on the Ilkhanate's governmental structure was profound and lasting, as the adoption of Islamic law and administrative practices required fundamental changes in legal procedures, taxation systems, and diplomatic relationships. The integration of Islamic legal scholars into the governmental apparatus provided expertise in jurisprudence and administrative theory that enhanced the dynasty's capacity for effective governance. The establishment of Islamic educational institutions and the patronage of Muslim scholars created centres of learning that preserved and transmitted Islamic knowledge while adapting it to the requirements of Mongol rule. The Golden Horde's establishment in the Western Steppes and Eastern Europe represented another major development in the empire's fragmentation, as Batu Khan's conquests had created a vast territory that included the Russian principalities, the Caucasus region, and portions of Central Asia. The Golden Horde's territorial extent encompassed diverse populations and environments that required different approaches to governance and military organisation. The integration of Russian principalities into the Golden Horde's administrative structure created unique challenges that involved managing Orthodox Christian populations while maintaining Mongol political supremacy and cultural identity. The Golden Horde's capital at Sarai, established on the lower Volga River, represented a strategic location that provided access to the river systems connecting the region with both European and Asian trade networks. The city's development reflected the Golden Horde's commitment to establishing permanent governmental institutions while maintaining the mobility that had characterized traditional Mongol society. Sarai's cosmopolitan character included populations from various ethnic and religious backgrounds, creating a diverse urban environment that facilitated cultural exchange and commercial development. The Golden Horde's relationship with the Russian principalities involved a complex system of tributary relationships that preserved local governmental structures while ensuring Mongol political supremacy and regular tribute payments. Russian princes were required to travel to Sarai to receive confirmation of their authority, a process that demonstrated their subordinate status while providing opportunities for diplomatic negotiation and cultural exchange. The tribute system generated substantial revenue for the Golden Horde, while allowing Russian territories to maintain their traditional administrative practices and religious institutions. The military organization of the Golden Horde combined traditional Mongol cavalry forces with local auxiliaries that possessed expertise in the specific combat requirements of European warfare. The integration of Russian military specialists provided knowledge of siege warfare techniques, river combat methods, and the logistical requirements for campaigns in forested environments that differed significantly from traditional steppe conditions. The Golden Horde's forces also included contingents from various Turkic peoples and other ethnic groups throughout the region, creating a diverse military structure that reflected the empire's multicultural character. The gradual conversion of Golden Horde rulers to Islam paralleled similar developments in other parts of the Mongol Empire and reflected both political considerations and genuine religious conviction. The conversion process was facilitated by the presence of Muslim merchants and scholars who had established communities throughout the Golden Horde's territories, providing religious instruction and demonstrating the practical benefits of Islamic legal and commercial practices. The formal conversion of Berke Khan in the 1260s marked the beginning of the Golden Horde's transformation into an Islamic state, although the process of complete Islamization would require several generations to complete. The Chagatai Khanate's establishment in Central Asia represented the fourth major division of the Mongol Empire, encompassing territories that included modern-day Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and parts of China and Afghanistan. The Chagatai Khanate's territorial extent included some of the most important cities along the Silk Road, providing access to the commercial networks that connected east and west, while generating substantial revenue through taxation and trade regulation. The Khanate's diverse population included Turkic peoples, Persian speakers, and various other ethnic groups that had developed distinct cultural traditions adapted to the region's environmental conditions. The Chagatai Khanate's governmental structure reflected the challenges of governing sedentary populations, while maintaining Mongol political traditions and military organization. The Khanate's rulers attempted to balance the needs of urban populations with the preferences of nomadic groups, creating administrative systems that could accommodate both lifestyles while ensuring political stability and economic prosperity. The integration of local administrators and religious leaders into the governmental apparatus provided expertise in managing the complex cultural and economic dynamics of Central Asian society. The religious developments within the Chagatai Khanate reflected the region's position at the intersection of various religious traditions and the gradual influence of Islam on Mongol rulers and populations. The Khanate's territories included significant Muslim populations, particularly in the urban centres that had been part of the Islamic world for centuries, while rural areas maintained various traditional religious practices. The gradual conversion of Chagatai rulers to Islam followed patterns similar to those observed in other parts of the Mongol Empire, reflecting both political considerations and the influence of Muslim scholars and merchants. The increasing military conflicts between the four Khanates represented a fundamental shift in the Mongol Empire's political dynamics, as regional interests began to supersede the imperial unity that had characterized the earlier period of expansion. The succession wars that had begun with the conflict between Kublai Khan and Arik Böke established precedents for armed conflict between different branches of the imperial family, while the development of distinct regional identities created new sources of political tension. The competition for resources, territory, and political influence led to a series of border conflicts that weakened the empire's overall military capacity while diverting resources from potential external expansion. The war between the Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde over control of the Caucasus region demonstrated how regional conflicts could escalate into major military campaigns that involved substantial portions of the empire's military resources. The conflict originated in disputes over territorial boundaries and tribute rights, but escalated into a prolonged war that required both sides to mobilize their full military capabilities. The campaigns involved sophisticated siege operations, naval warfare on the Caspian Sea, and coordinated military strategies that showcase the continued effectiveness of Mongol military organization, while revealing the costs of internal conflict. The economic consequences of interkhanate warfare created a cascade of internal problems that would prove more destructive to Mongol power than any external enemy had ever been. The disruption of trade routes between the competing khanates transformed the once unified Silk Road into a fragmented network of competing commercial systems, each subject to different taxation policies, currency standards, and diplomatic relationships. Merchants who had previously conducted business across the entire breadth of Eurasia under a single political authority now faced the complex challenge of navigating between hostile governments, each demanding tribute and imposing restrictions that made long-distance commerce increasingly unprofitable and dangerous. The fragmentation of the empire's administrative systems created immediate challenges for maintaining the sophisticated governmental apparatus that had enabled effective rule over diverse populations. The Yam postal system, which had provided rapid communication across thousands of kilometers, deteriorated as competing khanates refused to maintain stations in rival territories or provide resources for messages traveling to enemy courts. The breakdown of this communication network isolated regional administrators from central authority, while eliminating the intelligence-gathering capabilities that had provided early warning of potential threats and opportunities. The succession disputes that plagued each khanate reflected the fundamental weakness of the Mongol political system when applied to sedentary governance and the administration of complex urban societies. The traditional Mongol practice of dividing inheritance among all male heirs, which had worked effectively for managing pastoral resources and tribal territories, proved catastrophic when applied to unified imperial administration. Each generation of rulers faced the challenge of maintaining political unity while satisfying the legitimate claims of multiple potential successors, creating cycles of civil war that consumed resources and weakened central authority. The Yuan dynasty's internal problems exemplified the broader challenges facing Mongol rule in sedentary societies as the dynasty struggled to maintain Chinese political traditions while preserving Mongol military supremacy and cultural identity. The increasing adoption of Chinese administrative practices and cultural norms by Mongol elites created tensions with traditional Mongol nobles who viewed these changes as betrayals of their ancestral heritage. The gradual Sinicization of the Mongol ruling class reduced their effectiveness as military leaders, while failing to gain complete acceptance from Chinese subjects who continued to view them as foreign occupiers. The Yuan dynasty's economic policies contributed to growing social tensions that would eventually undermine the dynasty's stability and legitimacy. The heavy taxation required to support the imperial court and military establishment placed increasing burdens on Chinese agricultural populations, while the preferential treatment accorded to Mongol nobles and foreign merchants created resentment among Chinese scholars and officials. The dynasty's attempts to maintain expensive military campaigns in Southeast Asia and Japan consumed enormous resources while producing minimal strategic benefits, further straining the empire's financial capabilities. The administrative corruption that developed within the Yuan governmental system reflected the challenges of adapting traditional Mongol values to the requirements of Chinese bureaucratic administration. The appointment of officials based on personal loyalty rather than administrative competence created opportunities for corruption and inefficiency that undermined the dynasty's capacity for effective governance. The sale of governmental positions to the highest bidders, a practice that had been unknown in traditional Mongol society, became increasingly common as the dynasty's financial pressures mounted. The loss of nomadic military traditions among Mongol elites represented a fundamental transformation that weakened the empire's military capabilities while eliminating the cultural foundations that had enabled the original conquests. The adoption of sedentary lifestyles by Mongol nobles reduced their effectiveness as cavalry commanders, while creating dependencies on Chinese military specialists and foreign mercenaries. The traditional Mongol emphasis on mobility, endurance, and individual combat prowess gradually gave way to more conventional military approaches that failed to provide the tactical advantages that had made Mongol expansion possible. The overextension of imperial resources became increasingly apparent as the empire's territorial extent exceeded its capacity for effective administration and military control. The maintenance of garrisons throughout the vast territories required enormous expenditures that strained the empire's financial resources while providing diminishing returns in terms of security and political control. The distances involved in coordinating military operations across multiple continents created logistical challenges that exceeded the capabilities of even the most sophisticated pre-modern administrative systems. The external pressures that confronted the fragmenting Mongol Empire reflected the natural tendency of conquered populations to reassert their independence when central authority weakened. The resurgence of native dynasties represented not merely political rebellion but the revival of cultural and religious traditions that had been suppressed or marginalized under Mongol rule. These movements drew strength from deep-seated popular resentments against foreign domination while offering alternative visions of political organization that appealed to local populations. The Ming overthrow of the Yuan dynasty in 1368 represented the culmination of decades of growing Chinese resistance to Mongol rule and demonstrated the ultimate failure of the Mongol attempt to govern sedentary populations while maintaining their nomadic cultural identity. The Ming Revolution began with regional uprisings led by Chinese commanders who had served in the Yuan military but gradually developed into a coordinated campaign that exploited the dynasty's internal weaknesses and popular discontent. The rebel forces, initially composed of peasant militias and disaffected soldiers, evolved into professional armies capable of conducting sophisticated siege operations and coordinated campaigns across multiple provinces. Zhu Yuanzhang's rise from humble origins to become the Hongwu Emperor of the Ming dynasty illustrated the social mobility that had become possible during the period of Mongol decline, as traditional hierarchies broke down and capable individuals could advance through military service and administrative competence. His success in unifying Chinese resistance movements under a single command structure demonstrated the continued vitality of Chinese political traditions and the inadequacy of Mongol administrative methods for governing complex sedentary societies. The Ming Restoration represented not merely a change of dynasty, but a fundamental rejection of the foreign rule that had characterized the Yuan period. The Ming military campaigns that expelled Mongol forces from China demonstrated the evolution of Chinese military technology and tactical doctrine during the period of Mongol rule. The Chinese armies that confronted the Yuan forces possessed firearms, artillery and siege equipment that had been developed through the synthesis of Chinese innovation with technologies acquired from across the Mongol Empire. The Ming forces also employed military organization and tactical approaches that combined traditional Chinese strategic principles with lessons learned from observing Mongol military methods. The retreat of Mongol forces to the northern steppes following the Ming victory marked the end of the Mongol Empire's control over the world's most populous and economically productive region. The loss of Chinese resources eliminated the financial foundation that had supported Mongol military operations throughout Eurasia, while reducing the empire's capacity to maintain the administrative apparatus necessary for governing complex societies. The withdrawal to the steppes forced the Mongols to confront the fundamental limitations of their traditional political and economic systems when applied to the challenges of governing sedentary populations. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia and the Balkans represented another significant challenge to Mongol power, as the Ottomans developed military and administrative capabilities that proved superior to those of the declining Ilkhanate. The Ottoman expansion into former Mongol territories demonstrated the effectiveness of combining traditional Islamic governmental practices with military innovations that included the use of firearms and professional infantry formations. The Ottoman success in conquering Constantinople in 1453 symbolized the transfer of power from the declining Mongol successor states to new Islamic empires that possessed greater administrative sophistication and military effectiveness. The Ottoman military organization represented a fundamental departure from traditional Mongol military methods, emphasizing disciplined infantry formations and siege warfare capabilities rather than the cavalry mobility that had characterized Mongol tactics. The Janissary Corps, composed of professionally trained soldiers equipped with firearms and artillery, proved superior to traditional Mongol cavalry units in siege operations and urban combat. The Ottoman administrative system, based on Islamic legal traditions and bureaucratic practices developed over centuries of Islamic rule, provided more effective governance for sedentary populations than the adapted Mongol systems that had characterized the Ilkhanate. The Russian expansion against the Golden Horde represented the gradual assertion of Muscovite independence and the development of Russian military capabilities that could challenge Mongol supremacy in Eastern Europe. The process began with the refusal of Russian princes to pay tribute and evolved into coordinated military campaigns that exploited the Golden Horde's internal divisions and declining military effectiveness. The Battle of Kulikovo in 1380 demonstrated that Russian forces could defeat Mongol armies under favourable circumstances, while the final liberation of Moscow from Mongol overlordship in 1480 marked the end of the Golden Horde's political authority over Russian territories. The development of Russian military capabilities during the period of Mongol decline reflected the gradual adoption of new technologies and tactical approaches that proved effective against traditional Mongol methods. Russian forces incorporated firearms and artillery into their military organisation, while developing infantry formations that could resist cavalry charges. The construction of fortified cities and the development of siege warfare capabilities provided Russian forces with defensive advantages that neutralized the mobility advantages that had made Mongol expansion possible. The fragmentation of the Mongol Empire into smaller successor states represented the final stage in the dissolution of the world's largest contiguous land empire. The process occurred gradually over several generations as regional identities strengthened and central authority weakened, but the ultimate result was the emergence of numerous independent states that maintained varying degrees of Mongol cultural identity while adapting to local conditions and challenges. These successor states included the remnants of the 4 major khanates, as well as numerous smaller entities that controlled limited territories and populations. The Northern Yuan dynasty, established by Mongol forces that had withdrawn from China following the Ming victory, represented the most direct continuation of traditional Mongol political organization and cultural practices. The dynasty maintained control over portions of the Mongolian steppes, while attempting to preserve the governmental institutions and military traditions that had characterized the original Mongol Empire. However, the loss of Chinese resources and the fragmentation of the steppe populations into competing tribal groups severely limited the dynasty's capacity for effective governance and military action. The various Mongol successor states that emerged in Central Asia reflected the complex ethnic and political dynamics of the region, while demonstrating the continued influence of Mongol political traditions on local governmental structures. These states, including the various khanates that controlled portions of the former Chagatai territories, maintained Mongol titles and ceremonial practices while adapting their administrative systems to local conditions and populations. The gradual Turkification of these regions reflected the demographic and cultural changes that occurred as Mongol elites intermarried with local populations and adopted local languages and customs. The gradual assimilation of Mongol elites into local populations represented a fundamental transformation that eliminated the cultural distinctiveness that had characterized the original Mongol Empire, while preserving certain political and military traditions that continued to influence regional development. The process occurred differently in various regions, reflecting local conditions and the specific challenges faced by Mongol communities in different environments. In China, the process of Sinicization had begun during the Yuan period and continued as former Mongol officials and their descendants adopted Chinese names, customs, and cultural practices while maintaining certain elements of their ancestral heritage. The Islamic world witnessed a similar process of cultural assimilation as Mongol elites in the former Ilkhanate territories adopted Islamic names, religious practices, and cultural traditions while contributing their own governmental and military expertise to the development of new Islamic states. The synthesis of Mongol administrative practices with Islamic legal traditions created governmental systems that combined the efficiency of Mongol organization with the legitimacy provided by Islamic law and religious authority. The architectural and artistic achievements of the Timurid period reflected this cultural synthesis, as Mongol patronage supported the development of distinctively Islamic artistic traditions that incorporated elements from various cultural backgrounds. The maintenance of cultural distinctiveness in Mongolia proper represented the preservation of traditional Mongol identity in the face of external pressures and internal changes that had transformed Mongol communities throughout the former empire. The Mongolian steppes remained the center of traditional Mongol culture, where nomadic lifestyles, shamanistic religious practices, and tribal political organization continued to function despite the loss of imperial power and prestige. The preservation of the Mongolian language and oral traditions provided continuity with the imperial period while maintaining the cultural foundations that had enabled the original conquests. The development of Tibetan Buddhism among Mongol populations represented a significant religious transformation that provided new sources of cultural identity and political legitimacy, while maintaining connections with the broader Buddhist world. The gradual adoption of Tibetan Buddhist practices by Mongol communities created new forms of religious authority that supplemented traditional shamanistic practices while providing institutional frameworks for education and cultural preservation. The relationship between Mongol political leaders and Tibetan religious authorities created diplomatic connections that would influence regional politics for centuries. The enduring historical impact of the Mongol Empire extended far beyond the political boundaries and military achievements that had characterized the period of expansion, encompassing fundamental changes in the political, economic, and cultural development of Eurasian civilization. The reshaping of political boundaries that resulted from Mongol conquests created new territorial configurations that would influence international relations for centuries, while the demographic changes resulting from conquest and migration created new ethnic and cultural syntheses that enriched the diversity of Eurasian populations. The acceleration of global trade networks under Mongol rule established commercial relationships and trading practices that would continue to influence international commerce long after the empire's political fragmentation. The standardization of weights, measures, and commercial practices across vast territories created precedents for international trade regulation that would be adapted by subsequent commercial systems. The development of banking and credit systems that could function across continental distances provided foundations for the more sophisticated financial institutions that would emerge in later periods. The cultural exchanges that occurred under Mongol rule created unprecedented opportunities for the transmission of knowledge, technology, and artistic traditions across civilizational boundaries. The synthesis of Chinese, Islamic, European, and other cultural traditions that occurred in Mongol courts and administrative centers produced innovations in art, science, and technology that would influence human development for centuries. The preservation and transmission of classical texts through translation projects supported by Mongol patronage ensured the survival of important intellectual traditions that might otherwise have been lost. The technological innovations that resulted from Mongol-sponsored cultural exchange included advances in military technology, navigation, printing, and manufacturing that would prove crucial for the development of early modern civilization. The transmission of gunpowder technology from China to the Islamic world and Europe fundamentally altered the nature of warfare and contributed to the development of more sophisticated military organizations. The spread of printing technology facilitated the preservation and dissemination of knowledge, while contributing to the development of more literate and educated populations. The legal and administrative innovations developed under Mongol rule provided precedents for governmental organization that would influence the development of more sophisticated state systems throughout Eurasia. The Mongol emphasis on meritocracy and religious tolerance created governmental practices that would be adapted by subsequent empires and nation-states. The development of sophisticated communication systems and administrative procedures provided models for efficient governance that would prove valuable for managing complex societies and diverse populations. The Mongol Empire's ultimate legacy lies not in its military conquests or territorial extent, but in its role as a catalyst for the cultural, technological, and economic developments that would shape the emergence of the modern world. The empire's collapse marked the end of the last great nomadic empire and the beginning of a new era characterized by the dominance of sedentary civilizations and the development of more sophisticated governmental institutions. The Mongol achievement demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of nomadic political organization, while providing lessons about the challenges of governing diverse populations across vast territories. The transformation of Eurasia under Mongol rule created the foundations for the interconnected world that would emerge in subsequent centuries, as the commercial networks, cultural exchanges, and technological innovations fostered by the empire provided the basis for continued development and expansion. The Mongol Empire's contribution to human civilization extended far beyond its military achievements to encompass fundamental changes in the way diverse populations could interact, trade, and learn from one another. In this sense, the Mongol Empire's true legacy was not conquest, but connection. not destruction but the creation of a more integrated and culturally diverse world that would continue to evolve long after the last Mongol Khan had passed into history.